Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, who is Jordan Peterson, we have two sponsors for this episode. First is a site called Ground News. It's an app on your phone. You just touch the app and it opens up to whatever the leading headline stories are of the day. And it gives you not just the stories, but a bunch of different sites for the stories. And it ranks them based on political orientation or bias, either left-leaning or it's right-leaning or it's centrist. For example, here's one on Biden tells lawmakers he's open to compromise on U.S. infrastructure package. And you can see the sources there are leaning more red than blue or centrist. Or here's another one. Austrian government decides to buy Russian Sputnik V vaccine, chancellor says. And FedEx shooting. The FedEx shooting is pretty balanced there, left and right, mostly center, so that's good. The purpose for this site that I find useful is that here's my typical day. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Oh, sorry, that's the Los Angeles Times. My New York Times hasn't arrived yet today, and even the Santa Barbara Star News. Okay, that's just 4 papers for which I got to grind through and try to figure out what's going on, because I know that the biases on the Wall Street Journal kind of counter those on the New York Times. LA Times is more left-leaning, Santa Barbara News is more right-leaning, and so on. Well, what if I had 100 sites that I could access like that and have some kind of balanced treatment there of what the potential biases are? That's what Ground News does, so check it out. As a listener of this show, I'd like you to go to ground.news/Shermer and download your free app. Our other sponsor is the Great Courses. So that's an app you just touch on your phone. It looks like this right here. Boop, just touch on that. I opened this one up in particular because it's apropos for my podcast guest today. The course is Great Mythologies of the World, with 60 different lectures by multiple professors. So I'm going to listen to this one. Here's just a few samplings. Each of these 60 lectures is 30 minutes long. Gods and Humanity in Greek Thought, The Golden Fleece and the Hero's Return, Roman Heroes and Traitors. Let's just scroll down. Chaos and Order in Egypt, the Book of Job, the Great Indian Epics, the Bhagavad Gita, Stories of the Buddha, African Creation Stories, Heroes of African Myth, and down and down and down, Chinese Heroes, Kings, and Destroyers, Japanese Tales of Purity and Defilement, and so on and so forth. So here's the deal. When you subscribe to the app through my show, you get a free trial and 20% off, so that saves you about $30 a year. It gives you access to hundreds and hundreds of courses and thousands of lectures. And so check it out at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer and get your free trial. Okay, my guest today is none other than Jordan Peterson in his new book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. Most of you know already, but I'll give him a proper introduction. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is the author of 12 Rules for Life, which has sold more than 5 million copies worldwide. His YouTube videos and podcasts have gathered a worldwide audience of hundreds of millions, and his global book tour reached more than 250,000 people in major cities across the globe. I attended a few of those myself. It's a very interesting experience. Peterson worked for decades as a clinical psychologist and a professor at Harvard and the University of Toronto. And his 1999 book, Maps of Meaning, revolutionized the psychology of religion. I re-listened to that. I tried it the first time and couldn't get through. I did make it through his 12 Rules for Life. I gave Maps of Meaning another listen, and it was actually pretty enlightening. So Jordan and I have a really great conversation. It goes almost 3 hours. It's just epic, covering all the great topics. He's a really smart, interesting, insightful guy. I understand why he's controversial, but I don't see why you can't talk to people that are controversial, even if you don't agree with them on everything, which is perfectly okay. Okay, with that, please listen to Jordan Peterson. This is the new book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, which I read as the sequel to the original 12 Rules for Life. Beautiful covers, by the way. I love the black and white design. There's a lot of, I suppose, iconography meaning in that. And
Thank you. Thank you.
I loved it. I listened to this on audio, I don't know, about a month ago. And then, as you know, I started rereading Maps of Meaning. I did a 50-mile bike ride this morning, so I knocked off about 3 hours, but at 1.3 speed, I got about 4 hours into a Maps of Meaning. So that was cool. I think I figured out. But
you've been saturated. You've been saturated today.
I love that you read your own books. I like to listen to the author read their own books. Dawkins reads his books. Hitch read his books. And I like that because the author knows which phrases to emphasize and when, because it's their words. So, and I've done my...
You become aware of the melodic intent of the author, even if the author is you, when you're reading your own book. And when the book is complicated, like Maps of Meaning, you can emphasize parallel meanings between sentences by making the tones the same and the rhythm the same. And so I do think that it is an aid to comprehension.
For sure. Well, I like to start off my podcast with little anecdotes. So here's a one I thought of today while listening to your book. In the mid-'90s, I was on Bill Maher's show, Politically Incorrect. And this was his format. He had two guests on one side of the stage and two guests on the other facing each other, and he kind of sat in the middle. So next to me was the Saturday Night Live comedian Kevin Nealon. And, it was a half-hour conversational show, and, of course, Bill's a comedian. But Kevin Nealon was really funny. I mean, he was coming up with these snappy lines and the perfect timing. And I remember thinking, because this is fairly early in my career, thinking, man, I wish I could be funny like that. I just don't have the brain. My mind just doesn't go to a comedic, a turn like that, like his does. And then on the commercial break, he does this. He pulls out of his pocket a little card, and I see on the card the lines he was using. And I thought, oh, so this isn't just improvisation. This is like controlled or ordered chaos, which made me think of your book. In other words, of course, he does it in a way that sounds spontaneous. Maybe I couldn't do it like that, but that he was prepared to be spontaneously funny. And that kind of made me think of both the thesis of your new book. That is, we need order, but you also need a kind of a controlled chaos in your life to make it interesting, to be creative, to drive forward, but not just purely chaotic. There has to be some planning to it. And then I got to thinking, I wonder if Jordan actually writes like this, like if he has some rough outline and then starts writing, and then just sort of sees where he goes. Like I picture you sitting there going, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to think next. I'm just going to start writing and see which direction it takes me within kind of a larger framework.
Well, that is what I do. And I have a writing guidebook online, which we're turning into an app to help people write. And I suggest to my students that they separate the production from the editing. And I know neuroanatomically, verbal production and verbal editing are localized in different brain areas. So a stroke can take out one function or the other, or if you're really unlucky, both. But you don't want to edit while you're producing because it's inhibitory. And so in order to do that, however, you have to be willing to throw away a lot, so you loosen up the strictures. And that also means, though, there's discipline in that, even in the production end, because my sense is that if you're going to give a speech or if you're going to write something, you have to know about 3 times as much as you're going to write or say, at least. And then you can draw from this pool of knowledge that you've already aggregated, but you can do that in a spontaneous way. And that takes the strictures off the production end of it, and then you can edit. And there's kind of a Darwinian model at work there in some sense. Imagine that the first part of the creative process is overproduction, followed by culling. And all you have to do that is be willing to throw away. And that's fine. I usually keep what I throw away and put it in other files or documents, and I usually find a use for it. So it's very seldom wasted time.
Yeah, when I have to cut stuff, I put it in a file to be used again, because otherwise I feel bad about cutting. Like, oh, I put so much work into that, I don't want to lose it. And even though I may never use it again, at least it doesn't feel like I'm just throwing it away as a waste of time. It reminds me a little bit of Dean Keith Simonton's theory of genius, which is to say they just produce a boatload of content, a lot of content, and then there's kind of a natural selection process that they themselves impose, and then the public, consuming public, kind of culls or selects out which pieces they like the most. And then you end up seeing the kind of most successful pieces that the artist produces. What we don't see are the, thousands of unpurchased or unused or unseen pieces.
It's true in every possible creative domain. Like, we have no idea how many bad restaurants there has to be in order for there to be one good one. And the likely outcome is failure. There's marked off the charts successes, which is why creativity, I think, is retained as a strategic option. I mean, it's a personality dimension, right? Openness. And it does look like it's associated with this hyper productivity. It's associated with verbal intelligence and also the capacity for aesthetic experience and all of that. But certainly there is this phenomenon of overproduction followed by culling. And it does look like it mimics, that's why I called it a Darwinian process. It looks like an analog of the Darwinian process of creativity. And also, I think that I don't remember who said it. I think it was Alfred North Whitehead, that we think so that our ideas can die instead of us. And so there's even more than a direct analog in the Darwinian sense, because our thoughts are avatars in some sense, like they're fragmentary personalities, but we can test them out in an abstract world, and then we can kill them in that abstract world so that we don't have to embody them and die in the real world. And that's something that human beings are perhaps uniquely good at among all creatures. And it's a revolution, right? To allow for the possibility of abstract creativity and abstract death, as opposed to only biological creativity and actual death. Hypothetically, it's much preferable.
Yeah, Matt Ridley's new book on innovation makes the argument that there's pretty much no innovation you can think of, or invention, that doesn't have some precursor to it, and that we're all building on each other. And that there's something kind of deeply flawed about the patent system, the copyright system, the Nobel Prize system, whatever, as if, that's the guy right there who invented it on Tuesday afternoon at 2:00, when in fact it's almost never like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's tricky business because all of our systems are deeply flawed. And I suppose that's one of the themes in Beyond Order, is that it's an existential truth that all systems are flawed, and that you're in conflict with them because of that, because of their imperfections. The problem always comes in generating the better alternative. And, there are unique, you can bring things together in a manner that is unique and that does provide a genuine original contribution. And it is also useful to reward people for doing that. Even if you think about it selfishly, if creativity is a limited resource, which it certainly is, then we want to incentivize creative people the best we can. And that's very hard, because the creative enterprise is very likely to result in not only failure, but often catastrophic failure. And so I think it's necessary to tilt the system to reward successful creative people, because the cost of engaging in the enterprise is so unreasonably high. I mean, you think about the book world, it doesn't matter. Any creative domain is like this. The probability that your book is going to be successful is so infinitesimally low that if you were a reasonable person, you'd look at the odds and you'd think, I'd never do that. But having said that, one of the things that creative people do to get around that problem is that they create indefinitely. So you see serial entrepreneurs, and maybe they'll have, 8 failures before they succeed. And that also means, I suppose, you need a certain amount of emotional robustness to be able to tolerate the failure.
Yeah, Edison famously said he discovered 10,000 ways how not to make a light bulb.
Right. He tried, God only knows how many different filaments. It was I don't know if it was thousands, but it was at least hundreds, over and over and over. And Edison had hundreds of patents, and we have no idea how many failures he had, but certainly it would have been a multiple of that. So,
yeah, with Matt, I made the distinction between scientific discoveries, innovations, technological, and so on, versus, say, artistic. And the example I used was J.K. Rowling's novels. Surely she invented these characters and their actions that had she not been born, they wouldn't have appeared. But he pointed out that a lot of the themes in her books, like talking owls or whatever, are actually have a long literary tradition in history and mythology, going back to the Middle Ages. And that, again, even there, artists and writers
Well,
are building on each other.
absolutely. Well, the second volume in the Harry Potter series is basically a retelling. It's the same theme as Beowulf. And that's the same theme as the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, and that's man against the dragon. And so in the second volume, it's a basilisk that has the capacity to turn to stone anything that its gaze falls upon. And that's a prey response, right, to a predator, to be frozen like that. And so, yes, these themes are, if these themes didn't echo deeply inside of us, we wouldn't be able to understand the works. They wouldn't make sense. And they make sense in very strange ways. So we'll accept things that are preposterous without a second glance, not noticing that we're doing so. In Pinocchio, for example, we don't have any problem with the fact that we're watching a animated depiction of a wooden puppet rescue his father from the belly of a fire-breathing whale at the bottom of the ocean. Somehow that makes sense. And it makes sense because it touches on these deep narrative themes that are really instinctual. Our capacity to understand them is really instinctual. They're high order abstractions, high order abstractions, and they touch us deeply, emotionally, and motivationally. We can fall into them immediately. And a great artist has that operating in their imagination, and then can put a new spin on that. Hey, that's the thing, especially about the more mythologically oriented narratives. There has to be something new about it as well as the thing that's common and constant. So, someone asked me once, why don't we just tell the same archetypal story over and over if the archetype is so crucial? And the answer seems to be that you have to take the universal and make it singular and unique. And it's the combination of the universal with the singular and the unique that produces the story that's overwhelmingly compelling.
Yeah, in a way, your maps of meaning was prescient for the relatively recent evolutionary psychology of literature study, in which these lit and evolutionary theorists are talking about why certain themes come up over and over in high literature, Shakespeare and Jane Austen and Dostoevsky and so on. And it's because they're tapping into characteristics of human nature that are actually there. They're real. And so when we say a literary truth or a mythic truth, it's not just made up truths like pure subjective truths. There's an element of objective truth built into it, namely human nature.
Yeah, well, there's an element of Darwinian truth, and that makes things complicated because Darwinian truth and let's say Newtonian truth or classic objective truth don't look like the same things. And it's an analog to the problem in physics of the inability to reconcile. I think it's the theory of gravity and the theory of relativity. They both seem accurate, but no one knows how to unite them. Well, we have these narrative truths that look like they're Darwinian in their origin. They're evolved and they're unbelievably deep and unbelievably old. And obviously we evolved to live in the real world. So those stories and instinctual responses have been shaped by the real world and are therefore accurate enough reflections of the world so that if we embody the patterns, we're more likely to survive. So there's something about them that's deeply, deeply true, but they're not true like objective truths are true. And so, and no one knows exactly what to do about that. That's like the value fact distinction. It's a very similar problem because narrative world is the world of value.
But there, say, for example, the themes that come up over and over are things like hierarchy in social relations, jealousy, power struggles, love and anger, revenge. These are human universals. If you look at Donald Brown's list of several hundred human universals, these themes come up in every single society anyone's ever studied. That it's
Right.
just part of our nature. So that's what I mean. I think when you say literary truth or mythic truth, but there is an element of objectivity in there, namely these elements of our human nature that come up over and over because that's who we are. They're part of us.
Right. Well, and there's there's the biology underlying all of that's constant and universal across human beings. I mean, there's individual variation, obviously, but we're the same type of creature, which is why we can communicate. I mean, E.O. Wilson pointed out, even if we could talk to ants, we wouldn't have anything to say because we don't share their values or their motivations or their emotions. assuming ants have such things, but they at least have the behavioral analogs. And so what would interest an ant wouldn't interest us. We wouldn't be able to swap stories, but we can swap stories with people from other cultures because we have the same fundamental motivations and the same emotions, decorated, of course, by culture and transformed and elaborated by culture because we are cultural creatures. And what's interesting too is that depth of commonality stretches far beyond just human beings. I mean, we share emotion and motivational structure with animals way, way down the phylogenetic chain. You know, people criticized my first book, some people, because I pointed out that hierarchies, which you made reference to, are so ancient that lobsters and we devolved, let's say, from the common ancestor with lobsters hundreds of millions of years ago, but their response to hierarchy is governed by serotonin, just like our response. And they have responses to antidepressants that are similar to ours. And that shows you how ancient hierarchy is. And I mean, one of the failings, I would say, of modern theories that attribute inequality to, let's say, capitalism is the failure to take into account the unbelievably archaic nature of hierarchies and the propensity for hierarchies to produce unequal distributions of resources. I'm not saying that's a good thing. It has its benefits and it has its costs. But the hierarchy is definitely human universal. It's something we all contend with. That's symbolized, as far as I can tell, by the figure of the father, the evil tyrant, the tyrant and the wise king. Those would be the two poles of that image. And it's funny too, because I've also been criticized for identifying masculinity with order and the hierarchy. But I think that's so comical because almost all the people who criticized me for doing that, and it's not my idea, by the way, automatically assume that the patriarchy is masculine, and they don't notice that actually they're caught up in a symbolic representation. You see, it's so self-evident to people who make that claim that they never notice that there's a claim being made there. Well, it's the patriarchy. Well, it's masculine. Yeah, that's because since time immemorial, order has been symbolized by what's masculine and chaos by what's feminine. And that's not male and female. It's masculine and feminine. That's different. And both chaos and order are positive and negative. So there's no valence discrimination there. But see, my sense is, and you can tell me what you think about this, my belief is that we evolved, our cognitive abilities basically evolved as social cognitive abilities. We assessed the world, but the world that we assessed wasn't the objective world. It wasn't even the natural world, except maybe insofar as we were foragers and hunters. Certainly not the world as an objective place. We developed our intelligence to track social relations. And so we tend to view the world through a lens that automatically personifies everything. And so we personify the state as the king, fundamentally, as this masculine figure. But that's because once we got to the point where we could think about the objective world in any sense at all, we still had a powerful propensity to have it manifest itself to us in the form of personalities. And then over centuries and centuries of effort, we could detach certain observations from that underlying personality, what would you call it, overlay. But it takes great effort to do that, and it's a relatively modern phenomenon.
I was just thinking of the metaphor of the nation as a strong father figure versus a nurturing mother figure, and the book is Moral Politics, and the author's name is escaping me. The cognitive psychologist at UC Berkeley. Who put this forth. And so he explains, for example, that, when conservatives say we're in favor of small government and freedom and individuality, they're really not. I mean, they want a massive government when it comes to military and prisons and a court judicial system and police force and so on. They spend just as much money as Democrats do. And every administration for the last 75 years has grown the debt. You can't even tell when you look at the curve whether it's a Democrat or Republican. But the reason they do that is not because they are in favor of small government. They want a strong father figure. That is, the government itself is kind of a paternalistic organization because people are inherently bad or evil or sinful, and they need guidance. This is kind of the conservative worldview, why we need strong families and a strong father within the family and the nations like that. The liberals, on the other hand, he argues, that is more of a nurturing mother metaphor, and that the point of the government is to nurture people and help them when they can't help themselves, and look for a more egalitarian a structure and that sort of thing. Well, we impose metaphors on lots of things.
Right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Lakoff. Yeah, Lakoff, right. Yeah, sorry, I forget that name.
Right. Well, we found in our investigations that liberals, in terms of personality structure, they're higher in openness. That's the creativity dimension. And so you might say liberals are entrepreneurs and artists and so forth. And conservatives are lower in openness, but higher in conscientiousness. But agreeableness, which is the empathy dimension, roughly speaking, the liberals are more compassionate and the conservatives are more polite. And so the compassion element might go along with the maternal, let's say the use of a maternal metaphor. I don't know that of anyone who's done a rigorous empirical investigation of that kind of personification, but we did find that the liberal types tend to score higher in compassion. The conservative moral structure looks like it's more a cold moral structure in some sense. And that would be, this might hurt, but it'll be good for you in the long run. And so that would be something I think that's associated with conscientiousness. Imagine we have two fundamental social virtues, and one would be compassion. And it's kind of an immediate, right now, take care of me thing. And perhaps it's most useful for the care of infants because their demands are so immediate and so intense. And also infants are always right. You don't question them, certainly not before they're 6 months of age, because, well, they're just forces of nature. There's nothing there to criticize or judge. You just respond with an infinite ocean of compassion, essentially. Later, conscientiousness seems to, as maturation occurs, conscientiousness seems to become I would say, the paramount moral virtue. And it's a lot colder because it requires delay of gratification. And so, and so you can say, well, I can't just.
If you remember John Jost's study that was maybe 10 years ago, why people vote Republican or why people are conservative or whatever, his argument was along the lines of the big five personality dimension, and that people don't choose parties because they prefer this argument versus that argument or this tax policy or whatever. They gravitate toward parties that gel well with their personality. Like if I'm high in openness to experience, maybe low in conscientiousness, low in neuroticism, maybe, I feel better being around liberals or Democrats. Those are my people. It's just more comfortable.
Liberals are higher. Liberals are higher in neuroticism, especially if they're male. It's not pronounced, though. It's not a major determinant. Yes, and also
I think Jost had said that
this is some. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, Jost
There's
was
a bit
saying,
of a lag, so we're going to interrupt each other.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think Jost was arguing that. I remember he made something about conservatives respond more quickly to loud noises, and they're a little more anxious, and therefore they like a structured worldview. But that's old research now. Maybe that.
Well, it was an attractive theory to me for a long while, but the relationship between neuroticism and political belief is actually very, very small. It's surprisingly small. And when you see it, I mean, there are those studies that you described that look at anxiety responses at a micro level, but you'd expect to see that reflected in trait neuroticism, because neuroticism is the overarching rubric under which all the negative emotions are collected. And there isn't any evidence that conservatives are more neurotic than liberals, or that their worldview is motivated by fear. There is evidence, however, and it's becoming extremely powerful, that authoritarianism is associated with disgust, and like the correlations between parasite prevalence, for example, and authoritarian attitudes across countries is unbelievably high. There was a new paper published like a week ago showing that correlation was at the order of 0.7.
Wow.
It's
Whoa, that's
unbelievably
high.
high. It's
Yeah.
unreal. It's unbelievable. And there's not just one paper like that. There's several. I'm actually going to be talking with the gentleman who originated that theory. And at the moment, unfortunately, his name escapes me, but he's going to be on my podcast real soon. But it's an absolutely fascinating hypothesis. So imagine that conservatives do like borders. And the reason for that is that they're concerned about contamination, and that might even extend into the domain of contamination by ideas. But that contamination fear is real because intermingling populations produce contamination, as we've certainly seen in the last year. And that's been often fatal to huge swaths of human populations in the past. I mean, the Europeans were very hard on the indigenous people, but European diseases were far harder on the indigenous people than the Europeans themselves. And sometimes that was used, as a technique of warfare. But I believe that by the time the Pilgrims landed on the shores of Massachusetts, or what became Massachusetts, approximately 95% of the native population had already been decimated by imported illnesses. And so you can imagine liberals are temperamentally inclined to permeable borders, and that's because they're high in openness and low in conscientiousness, especially orderliness. And so they see the advantages of information flow, and they're on the side of the creative revivification of archaic structures in society. But the conservatives say, look, fair enough, but wait a minute. You don't know what you're letting in, and along with what's good, you might be letting in what isn't so good. And that's why I think Trump could appeal so rapidly to people, for example, with his emphasis on borders. And I don't think there is a more trenchant and emotionally relevant issue in the political landscape than the issue of borders. And not just between states, but between concepts, between identities, all of that. The conservatives like the borders tight and clean. And the liberals say, yeah, but you lose a lot without that interplay of information. And the problem is, the eternal problem is, they're both right. There's huge advantages to free information flow and the free flow of people, and there's devastating disadvantages. And so we're caught in a terrible paradox there. And I think the way we resolve that paradox constantly is by an ongoing political discussion that's relevant to the issues of the day. There's no way of permanently solving it. It's an intractable issue.
Here's the quote I like from John Stuart Mill from On Liberty. A party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. And then from Bertrand Russell, a little bit longer quote. This is how I think your tension between chaos and order in the new book cash out here. Quote from Bertrand Russell, from 600 BC to the present day, philosophers have been divided into those who wish to tighten social bonds and those who wish to relax them. It is clear that each party to this dispute is partly right and partly wrong. Social cohesion is a necessity, and mankind has never succeeded in enforcing cohesion by merely rational arguments. Every community is exposed to two opposite dangers: ossification through too much discipline and reverence for tradition on the one hand, and on the other hand, disillusion or subjection to foreign conquest through the growth of an individualism and personal independence that makes cooperation impossible.
Right. Well, and that, I would say, not only is that an eternal political theme, but it's also an eternal narrative trope. The battle between the forces there, so that would be the forces, let's say, of liberation and progress, and the forces of tradition, but also between the characters that value one more highly than the other by temperament. And it is by temperament, right? So Joe, I wouldn't say that people vote their temperament and that's it, because we're not determined like that. We are very flexible creatures, but what your temperament does is give you a first pass biasing of the information that you're likely to process. And so it's very difficult to work against, because if you're high in openness, let's say, and low in orderliness, there's certain kinds of information that you're going to expose yourself to, like fiction, for example, because that'll attract your interest. And so even if your cognitive content, personal cognitive content, what you've learned is an unbiased sample of what you've read and been exposed to, your temperament is going to bias what you've been exposed to. And it's very, very difficult to work at counter purposes to that. And then if you do, you have to do it consciously, and you sort of have to do it from the bottom up. So if you want to make yourself orderly and you're not by temperament, you have to build up the micro habits from their basis. And that's extraordinarily difficult. You can do it, but it's an act of will. Whereas if you're temperamentally inclined that way, you started doing that back when you were like 3 and you built the micro habits as you developed. It's part of your biological flowering. And it's really important to understand this because, you think, well, how can people think like that? And the answer is they're actually different than you. They're different than you. And not only that, you need them. So if liberals are entrepreneurs, conservatives are managers, and good luck running a business full of entrepreneurs. They don't have they're going to be dragged out by their interests into other domains. They can't stick to the topic at hand. They're not temperamentally inclined to do that.
Somebody has to work for those entrepreneurs to do the day-to-day grind and get the work done.
Well, that's the thing. You take the original idea and you turn it into an algorithm. And once it's an algorithm, you want conscientious people who to implement it. And you don't even want open people because they're going to be bored by it, right? Because nothing changes. So there isn't going to spark their interest.
Like when it's like when Steve Jobs hired John Scully from Coca-Cola to run Apple and make it a proper big company. And then, apparently Jobs got rather bored with the whole process. It's like, this is just a grinding big corporation process of building. I want to do something creative and different. So he left and started those new companies, and then came back when Apple was about to fold again, and then launched the new creativity products.
And that's exactly right. Right. When the old ways don't work, you need to call in somebody who's creative to tap down into the structure of the company and figure out what's ossified and then transform it. But your company isn't successful unless you can transform it into an algorithm, right? That's actually a hallmark of success. So it's self-defeating in some ways from an entrepreneurial perspective because it's going to become a grind if you actually do it right. But that's fine. You hire conscientious people. You hire conservatives because that's exactly what they want and what they're good at and what attracts their interest. So maybe they find pleasure in duty, and the same sort of intrinsic pleasure that someone who's more creative might find in novelty and the free exchange of ideas. And it's so funny because we have this huge conversation in our culture about diversity. But we actually are very uncomfortable with the idea that people are different, really different, and they really are. And we're very uncomfortable with the idea that those differences have a biological root and that they manifest themselves in different interests and abilities. You see this, the most striking example of that for me is the fact that, and this is a fact, it's been demonstrated in multiple high quality studies, as you make your society more egalitarian in its social structure with regards to sex, the differences in job preference between men and women maximize rather than minimizing. And you can't even get that conversation off the ground to some degree, even though the facts are in, and it's as well documented a phenomenon as anything in any of the social sciences. In fact, I think it's one of the most well documented facts, and no one predicted it, no one expected it.
Here, are you referring to the fact that there are two biological sexes, and yet we're now undergoing something of a huge conversation about the kind of the fuzzy border in between where you can be trans?
I was thinking more about the fact that there's a disproportionate number of male engineers and female nurses in the Scandinavian countries. Just something that simple.
Yes.
You put in egalitarian social policies and you maximize certain biological differences.
Right.
And the other thing that's strange is those differences don't have to be that big to have a walloping effect, because people generally are driven by the extreme parts of their temperament. So if you're very compassionate, well, perhaps you're more likely to go into nursing. And if you're very thing-oriented, you're more likely to go into engineering. And there's not that much difference in agreeableness, which is the trait that would differentiate those between men and women. It's 60-40, something like that. It's not that big. But at the extremes, it's massively different, like it is with antisocial behavior, physical violence. And so men and women are different in their proclivity to violence, and men are more likely to use physical violence. The difference isn't that big at the mean, but it's huge at the extremes. And so the prisons are full of men.
as Pinker says, the number one predictor of violence is maleness.
Yeah, might be that and alcohol, eh?
that doesn't help. Yeah, I was just thinking
Yeah,
of my little 5-year-old when we go to Target to get a new toy, which he likes to do quite frequently. They've kind of structured it now where the girls' toys are more up front, or they're kind of more mixed with the boys' toys rather than two separate. But he just zeroes right in on the trucks and cars and planes and hardware stuff. And I don't force this. I'm a pretty laissez-faire guy. I don't care what he wants to play with, but he just, and so sometimes I'll like push a little, like a girl toy toward him, and he has zero interest. And if I put it right in front of him, he just basically swats it away. It's almost humorous.
Yeah.
It's just so obvious that there's a biological difference there.
Well, you see toy preference differences in chimpanzees, even. And it's the same thing. Weirdly enough, the male chimps, juveniles, will prefer wheeled things, even though,
Right.
what the hell. But it's who knows what it is, a prototype gadget module of some sort that's there in its nascent form in chimps who have a minimal tool using capacity, but not zero. But that's how deep that interest difference is. And it does very much look like a difference in interest rather than ability that's driving these sex differences in occupation. There are some cognitive differences between men and women, but they aren't the determining factor by all appearances.
Yeah,
interest makes a huge difference.
Those occupational interest tests they give you in high school tend to cash out in real world similar percentages of gender differences in different kinds of jobs. So it isn't ability, it isn't discrimination, it's just what people are interested in. And this is the problem I think we're facing now, is this confusion over equal treatment versus equality of outcomes in terms of just the percentages. In other words, if Google doesn't have the exact percentage of African Americans or women as programmers, then they must be discriminating. Well, how about just people migrate to where they want to go and what they're interested in doing as another factor?
Well, at least as another factor, right? I mean, we could certainly admit that there's likely to be counterproductive discrimination everywhere because our selection methods are imperfect. And so we can say, sure, there's discrimination, and that serves no one's interest. But it's multifactorial, and that's crucial. And I have a chapter in the new book called Abandon Ideology, and it's written partly from the perspective of an informed social scientist, I think. And one of the things you learn if you do social science research seriously is that the probability that there's one factor driving the complex thing you're looking at is very low. I mean, there are powerful factors. IQ tends to be a very powerful single factor, but wage gap difference, that's multifactorial. It's very complex. And one factor might be discrimination, but there's like 10 others that are of equal import, and they have to be faced seriously because otherwise we produce bent social policy. We'll keep trying to force identical gender distribution outcomes without noticing that we can't force them through social engineering because that isn't what's producing them to begin with. So, the laws will just get more and more draconian, or the interventions more and more severe. And, men, for example, are more likely to work in dangerous jobs and they pay higher. So you have to take that into account. They work longer hours, and that looks like an interest issue as well. And that's not saying that that's necessarily a good thing, right? It might be better, perhaps, to have a more balanced life than to concentrate obsessively on one thing. There's costs and benefits to both, but these things have to be taken into account.
Yeah, when I was in college, I remember trying to look to see which different kind of careers I wanted to pursue. And, doctors, lawyers, and business corporate leaders, CEOs. But I thought, those guys, they work a lot. They work like 60, 80 hours a week. That doesn't sound like a good life to me. I don't really want to do that. Maybe I would make more money, but who cares? I'd rather have the autonomy in my free time. So I initially pursued an academic career because at least the time is my own, even if I work 80 hours a week or whatever. So this idea that, we need more women CEOs, first of all, very few people can become CEOs or say Caltech engineering professors or whatever. But But why would you want that job? I mean,
well, that is something that's very much worth questioning. I mean, my sense, and I did a lot of clinical work with high performing people and had a chance to observe them in academia among my peers, but also and among graduate students, but also in the broader business and professional world. And it takes a singular combination of traits to be a C-suite person or the equivalent. And one thing is incredible efficiency and persistence. So not only are you working 80 hours a week, you do that all the time and you do it nonstop. So it's not like, you talk to an undergraduate and he says, or she says, I spent 8 hours in the library yesterday studying, and then you do a little microanalysis and you find out that really they spent, 40 minutes studying maybe and 7.5 hours wasting time. But the people that occupy those C-suite positions, they're actually working all that time. And they've trained them. Well, they have the temperament. They're very likely to be conscientious. So they start with that. And perhaps that was also fostered in their household because that does help. So here's an example of that. So the children of first-generation Asian immigrants are disproportionately successful. And it looks like the reason for that is something like socialization for conscientiousness. And that seems to produce the equivalent of about a 15-point IQ advantage, which is about the difference between the typical college graduate and the typical university or high school graduate. It's a big difference. It's a big one standard deviation. So, to be a CEO or to be hyper successful, you have to be, let's say, 2 to 3 standard deviations or more above the mean for IQ. So that wipes out like 85% of the population right off the bat, or 95% really. And then you have to be in the 95th percentile for conscientiousness, and those are uncorrelated. So that's 5% of 5% with the first 2 cuts. So there's a singular personalities that end up in those situations. And I think, that there's an added advantage that men have motivationally to pursue those jobs. And the advantage is that status confers upon males sexual attractiveness, status within the patriarchal hierarchy, let's say. So women are much more likely to choose high status men, assuming that the definition of status is defined by the hierarchy within which they're competing. Okay. Men have zero preference for women who are high status in that way. Or actually the correlation is slightly negative. And so to be a CEO and be a woman means that you have to have all those personality attributes, but then you don't gain this tremendous reproductive advantage. And I think that advantage is so marked that it's actually built into men. It's not only motivating consciously. If I'm successful, I'll be more successful with women. It's built in biologically.
Well, and you want status among your fellow males too, like athletes compete against each other, and you want to get the respect of your fellow males, say in your group. At least, I mean, speaking as a male, yeah, I remember some of my academic friends, professor friends, who wanted to work their way up to become department chair and then a dean and then maybe a chancellor or president. And I remember thinking, why? Those guys wear suit and ties and they're there all day and they never travel. It's like a real job. Why would you want that? And, so again, there's trade-offs. As Thomas Sowell always says, there's no solutions. They're just trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off. You're giving up a lot to pursue that for status and money or whatever else the motive is. Well,
look, I had this roommate. He came from Alberta like me, so he was a small town rural guy. And he went to McGill and then went off to New York. He's very, very smart, rough guy, very adventurous guy. Went off to New York, became a corporate lawyer. And his plan was to go to New York, make a pile of money, and then go travel. Like he went up the Amazon. He went into China when so few Caucasians had gone there that they had to put him in jail in one part of China because he got mobbed so badly. It was the only place, because people were curious about him. It was the only place they could put him that was safe. So in any case, he was going to go to New York and make a bunch of money and then be his adventurous self. But, you go to New York and you adopt a job, one of those high pressure jobs in a top law firm, And the socialization pressure is so intense, you've never experienced anything like it in your life. And if you do that for 10 years, you're a corporate lawyer. You're not whoever you were to begin with. Maybe the conscientiousness remains. And so I saw him about 15 years later. And it was so funny because when he walked into the restaurant, he had a high-powered New York suit on. He was a really sharp-looking guy. And he looked the part exactly. And I thought, geez, I look just like a professor because I had my tweed jacket on and my leather jacket. I was much more casual. And I thought, we really became what we pursued. And so these trade-offs that you talk about, they're real, right? They're real. You sacrifice much of what you could be for who you are going to be. And that's a good sacrifice because you should become something, but it's still a real sacrifice. So
let's talk about
it's also something.
Well, I was just going to
the other thing
that, go ahead, Jordan.
Please go ahead. We're having lag problems again.
Sorry. So back to maps of meaning. You wanted to talk about that, and I do too, because I think I've got some insights on where you were going with that, because I read that a couple of years ago, and then I've been working on a new book project called What is Truth Anyway? I just finished a 2-day filming of a video book version, which is apparently going to be a new technology, video books. At any rate, I'll expand it to a longer version. So here I'm making a distinction between objective truths, subjective truths, and within that, like historical truths, political truths, religious truths, literary truths. We've hinted at some of that. Let me just take 2 minutes to kind of just summarize that, give you an example. So for example, if I say an objective truth, if I say, well, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed today at 32,862.3, that's objectively true. I just looked it up. Ooh, bad red day. Let's not look at the stock market on a down day. But you can see it. I can see it. We can confirm it. But if I say, A Stairway to Heaven is the greatest rock song of all time, and you go, no, Freebird is the greatest rock song of all time, there's no experiment we're going to run or test to decide which is the best rock song, right? Those are internal subjective preferences or tastes, something like that.
It's definitely not Freebird.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Not Freebird. All right. I don't know what you Canadians like up there, but I know the Canadian Railroad Trilogy song. Yes. Anyway, but you can then go from, say, a subjective truth to an objective truth. My example I like to use is, meditation works for me. Well, that's a subjective truth. It's true for me. I don't know if it's true for you. But what people like Deepak Chopra and our mutual friend Sam Harris want to do is say, no, this is actually works for everybody or most people. Or you can run some empirical tests like Deepak has done to say, if 60% of the population meditates 20 minutes a day, every day, they'll have these measurable outcomes, lower blood pressure, lower stress hormones, headaches go away and depression is relieved and so on. So they want to argue it's not just a subjective truth. There's an objectivity to it that we can measure. So they're trying to shift it from subjective to objective. And then if I go like political truths, I might say, like if you believe in a progressive tax and I believe in a flat tax and somebody else believes in a regressive tax, there's no right answer to that other than, this, whatever the society's goals are and how they've decided through elections to achieve those goals to, increase the tax revenue or whatever, or have the fairness of who pays what, then that's the right answer, at least for the next 4 years until the new presidential administration is in place and they change it. But then I would say, so that may be purely subjective, but then I might say something like that democracies are better than autocracies. That's not just a subjective truth. That has an element of objectivity to it in as much as people vote with their feet. They prefer to live in democracies than autocracies. And why do they prefer that? Because they prefer to flourish. They prefer to have freedom rather than slavery. They prefer to be satiated rather than hungry. They prefer more options, better schools, better streets, and so on. Compare East Germany to West Germany, during the Cold War. Compare North and South Korea today. There, I would argue that we are getting an ought from an is. People really do prefer democracy, so we ought to pursue those. And there, I'm making that transition from a subjective truth to an objective truth. And I see in your work that kind of tension between those, like with myths and stories and a lot of the political issues you discuss, like immigration. You were just talking about that. There is some, I'm not sure it's purely subjective. There's some measure of like how many people we're going to let in based on what our goals are. That's maybe subjective, but maybe it's grounded in some objective truths we're all in search of. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are subjective universals, I would say, and they and that's a category. So imagine there's objective and subjective, but then there's this category of subjective universals. And so you might experience the truth at a bunch of people might experience that truth at different times and in different places, but the truth still is experienced by a multitude of people. We don't really know what to make of those sorts of truths because they sort of they exist in a place that's not well defined by the distinction between subjective and objective. I think that's actually somewhat different than voting with your feet, the example of voting with your feet. I mean, you operationalized better there. That's where I would go after you if I was trying to make the case that that's still subjective. I would say, well, you, with a sleight of hand motion, you equated better with emigration proclivity. And we could debate whether that's a valid measure of better, but I could easily say, well, that's only one measure of better. There's lots of them. And you have the problem of time frame. You know, so if I was a radical Marxist environmentalist, I might say, well, yeah, people vote with their feet to go to a Western society where we allow impulsive pleasure to outweigh long-term sustainability. And so it looks we're chasing this chimera because we're going to pay through the nose for our devastation of the earth to produce this material wealth. It's an illusion. And so it's actually not better. Time frame is a killer when you start talking about value distinctions, right? Even to start doing that, you and your opponent have to agree on what time frame you're going to calculate the events across. And then, of course, you can argue with that. Part of the problem with trying to transform those subjective truths into objective truths is that it's the parameterization of it and the formalization of it. So if you say, well, we can look up the Dow Jones Index, you know that I have a measurement device, the phone. It's exactly the same as your measurement device. You know that I can refer to it. And so the fact of that measurement device in some sense and its universality and the fact that you know of it makes the claim that that's an objective truth instantly possible. With the more subjective truths, it's much more difficult to determine what you should measure over what time frame and with what technology. And so so those are some of the methodological problems that stop us from making that transformation.
Yeah, another example I use is with democracy is during the Bush administration, he referenced Nathan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy. So I read it, and that gave me insight into W's foreign policy. And Sharansky argues that it's kind of racist to say, well, some people are just not ready for democracy. You know, they're too tribal or African tribes. They're not ready for democracy. He argues against that, saying that's kind of racist and bigoted to say that. This isn't rocket science. I mean, we should spread democracy because it's good for people. That's what they really want. But we saw how well that went in the Middle East, when Bush went in there with the military and said, okay, we're going to make you a democracy. So this is going to be good for you. Well, it didn't work out so good because, a lot of these, kind of tribal tensions don't work well with a kind of a liberal democracy structure. So maybe that's not the right approach. And maybe.
Well, the problem there, again, I think it's part of this parameterization problem, again, is like democracies work well in the West by a variety of different measures. You could argue about their long-term sustainability, and we do argue about that. But we also don't know what the preconditions for their flourishing are, and most of those preconditions are actually invisible. They're so built into the technological and social infrastructure that we can't even detect them. We don't know what they are. So, you have 330 million people in the United States, and essentially they live together peaceably. Well, and they can conceive of themselves as something approximating a cohesive unit. So they're a single tribe, at least in some ways. Why? Well, we don't know. And you can be sure that it's going to be a function of things that we can't even begin to understand at the moment. I mentioned earlier when just you and I were talking, I think before we did this podcast, that there's this evidence showing that authoritarian attitudes are much more likely in countries that have high parasite loads. I mean, for all we know, that one of the preconditions for the establishment of a stable democracy is the eradication of malaria and other parasitic diseases, transmissible parasitic diseases. We have no idea. We have no idea. Our whole, this is why I concentrate on order, at least to some degree in my writings, is that there's all sorts of invisible pillars that are supporting us, and we change things that we don't understand at our peril because of that. Classic conservative argument. I do understand that things still have to change, so tough luck for us. But that's another problem with making things universal, trying to make things universal.
Yeah, I guess that's what conservatives would argue. Well, faith and flag, family, a Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview is how America is defined, and a strong military, and on and on. And liberals go, no, that's not how we define our tribe. Our tribe is, and then they have their tropes, and maybe that's part of that eternal tension in there.
It certainly is part of the eternal tension, because what you identify with, if your culture is amenable to your temperament, what you identify with in that culture is going to be those things that appeal to your temperament, for sure. And one of the things you can certainly say about the United States is that it's a diverse enough culture so that there are elements of it that would appeal to virtually every temperament. And that's also perhaps one of the reasons that it's stable. It's like we need to have a world where every temperamental permutation can find its niche, right? Can find its place to trade what it has to offer in its diversity, to have that be valued. Otherwise, you generate people who they don't fit in. They can't trade. They have nothing of value to offer, and then then things are going to become radically unstable. All these countries too that we're trying to export democracy to, let's say, it isn't even always obvious to me that they're countries. We call them countries and we draw borders on the globe, and so they give us the illusion that they're countries. But I really like, there's a book called The Mystery of Capital. I believe that's the name of it. And it's like empirical anthropology, and it's partly an attempt to find out what enables capitalism to exist. And one of the propositions in the book is that, well, we're really good in the West at taking an object and assigning abstract ownership to it, and then trading the abstract ownership. So he makes the case, for example, that slum dwellers in these large third world cities aren't as poor as we think because they have property, but they can't monetize the property because the borders aren't defined. And because the borders aren't defined, you can't assign ownership. Because you can't assign ownership, you can't trade. And so one of the things that his team was doing was assigning borders in these highly densely populated areas to start the capitalist process going. Well, we have to be able to mark your ownership in a reliable way. And we just take that sort of thing for granted. We don't even notice that it's a kind of miracle. And you can produce unbelievable value by doing that sort of thing. I mean, there's these new things that have been invented called non-fungible tokens. I think that's it.
Yes,
where you can assign
crazy.
Right. But in some sense, not so crazy, because what it does is it opens up the possibility of assigning ownership, the tradable ownership, to things that couldn't be owned before. And eBay did that to a huge degree. It unlocked frozen capital, right? Because it provided a marketplace where all the junk you had in your attic could suddenly be monetized. So there was the introduction of a technology that enabled you to describe in the abstract what you had to a huge population. It was like a reverse classified ad. And that turned out to be worth billions of dollars. And so there are all these things that underlie our complex systems, and there's no evidence whatsoever that we understand what they are. And then we try to export them into places that don't have that infrastructure. It's sort of like, here's a good example. You go into a Home Depot. It's always a miracle to me to go into a Home Depot. So there'll be a corridor there, and all there is in the corridor is nuts and bolts and screws of of all these massively different sizes, this incredible variety of fasteners, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And so, you take a tractor and you put it in a place that doesn't have that infrastructure, it's only a tractor for about 10 minutes. As soon as a part goes, it's not what it was at all. And it's because the tractor depends for its integrity as a tractor on this unbelievably dense underlying infrastructure that we only dimly comprehend. And so our political and social artifacts are like that. They're like complex machines, like military helicopters, and we export them and we think, well, this will work because it's a thing. It's like, no, it's not. It's a complex biological entity that's dependent on an ecosystem. And when you take it out of the ecosystem, it can't survive.
Yes, this assignment of property and property rights to individuals, every economist knows that's what you got to do. Like step one to turn a developing country into a developed country. But as you know, Marxists say, well, no, that's the start of the problem, because from there you're going to have inequality.
Yeah, but that's complete nonsense, because you get inequality. Look, inequality is a terrible problem. Don't get me wrong. One of the reasons I don't like Marxists is because they don't take the problem of inequality with anywhere near enough seriousness. They think it's a byproduct of capitalism. That's just not correct at all. That's really wrong. There aren't any societies that you can find, no matter how far you go back in history, where you don't see radically unequal distribution of resources. And that's true not only for humans, but it's also true for animals. So when birds come north in the spring, they compete for nesting territory. So there's a hierarchy of locales for desirable nests. And so you want shelter from rain, shelter from sun, shelter from wind, proximity to a food source, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a competition, even among birds that aren't really that social in their nature. There's a competition for those primary positions. They're scarce and they're unequally distributed. And that's the rule. Now, we know that when inequality becomes starts to produce undue suffering, let's say, even if it's just suffering in relationship to status, that the hierarchy becomes unstable, because the men, especially at the bottom, especially if they're young, they'll become violent and they'll break the whole thing apart because they're willing to take a risk to be disproportionately successful. And the reason for that is because it's so tightly associated with their status in relationship to women. And so inequality is a huge problem. Any society, even if you're a conservative, you have to say, look, we don't want to let things get too unequal because we'll destabilize the entire structure. So
in Christopher Baum's book, Origins of Morality, he's an anthropologist that studied all these hunter-gatherer groups. He's got a nice database in there showing that this idea that our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in an egalitarian society is a myth. They don't want equality. In fact, you have to, all those rituals about food sharing have to be in place because they don't want to share food. They're not naturally born egalitarians. That has to be structured in there with lots of rules. And then he has a whole thing on free riders. There's always some percentage of bullies and free riders, cheats, and so on. And so much of the rule systems developed in these hunter-gatherers are to deal with the free riders and the bullies, from gossip.
Well, that's
shaming.
the problem with compassion. That's the fundamental technical problem with compassion as a singular moral virtue, is that compassion is vulnerable to disruption by psychopathy. Right? It provides no protection against malevolent predators, none. And so if you have a society that's only agreeable, empathic, and egalitarian, a malevolent predator has free reign. It's a huge problem.
I was curious what you think about Kevin Dutton's research on positive psychopathy. That is to say, we always think of psychopaths as the serial killers and so on. But in fact, most CEOs and Wall Street traders and special forces and Navy SEAL guys, these are all, they have traits of psychopathy. That is, they're fearless. They don't worry about what other people think. They don't care about other people. They just have a job to do. And he makes the point, that's who you want there. You want a badass motherfucker on the front lines in the Navy SEALs to take care of the job. You don't want him to have any empathy, right? Something like that. I'm exaggerating that.
Well, okay. So I just had a long discussion with Jocko Willink, and Jocko states very forthrightly in that interview, that discussion, that ever since he was 3 years old, he wanted to be a soldier. And he disavows any higher order moral virtue to that desire. He wanted to go out and be a soldier, to do what soldiers do. It was intrinsic. It was an intrinsic part of his personality. And make no mistake about it, I mean, we've been warriors forever, and some people are born like that. And he's definitely one of them. But he's highly socialized. So look, there's this line of research. I'm going to talk to one of the guys who pioneered it soon. So if you look at male children, okay, first of all, we get less aggressive as we age, human beings. The most violent creatures are 2-year-olds. Punch, kick, hit, bite, steal. That's the definition. Physical violence. Okay. 2-year-olds, if you group people together in age similar groupings, the 2-year-olds have the most violent altercations. But then if you look at the 2-year-olds, it's a minority of the 2-year-olds who are violent. They're almost all male, and it's a small minority of the males. Okay. Most of those males are socialized out of that antisocial aggression by the time they're 4. Those that aren't are permanently antisocial, although that declines after the age of about 27. And that's well known among researchers who study antisocial behavior. It's actually an element of penological theory. You incarcerate multiple offenders till they're older, till they burn out in their late 20s. And maybe that's a maturation phenomena. No one really knows, but it's reliable. Anyways, let's take that minority of aggressive kids. So, well, what does it mean to be aggressive? And this pertains to psychopathy. Psychopathy isn't a unitary dimension. It's not a personality attribute. It's a combination of traits. And so a real psychopath is low in agreeableness, so low in compassion, low in politeness. That's the best personality predictor of criminal behavior. It's not very good, but it's the best one. And they're low in conscientiousness. Okay, so they have a parasitic lifestyle, that's low in conscientiousness, and they have no empathy. That's bad news. And then you can decorate the psychopathy. You could add low neuroticism to that, so there's no fear. You could add assertiveness from the extroversion dimension. So like your ultimate psychopath might be charming and assertive, right? Low in fear, low in agreeableness, low in conscientiousness. So they don't care about you. They'll exploit you for the future. They don't forego gratification, but they're charming. And so now, then you can decompose that and you can say, well, those constituent elements of those traits are often extremely useful. Now, Jocko and his crew, the Navy SEAL types, they're deadly when you put them out against an enemy, but they're unbelievably socialized. Like Jocko stated very straightforwardly and makes a very credible case that the Navy SEALs their fundamental motivation isn't status for themselves. It's to protect the other people in the group. They're incredibly group affiliated. And I think you see that in any functional group of competitive men is they compete for the position, but they have each other's backs. And if they don't, what you do with a guy like that, who you can't trust in the clinch, is you isolate him. Even if he's competent, if he won't subserve that competence to the group, you don't trust him. You won't. And I think that's grounded in, this is an objective truth, we could say. It's bordering on an objective truth, because in order to be in a position of authority for any length of time, you have to play an iterable game. It has to be able to repeat. And unless you engage in reciprocal behaviors with others, you can't dominate a social group for very long, because it'll rebel. So there's real constraints on the exercise of power in any functional hierarchy. And you even see that among chimps. Frans de Waal has documented this extremely well. The tyrant chimp can prevail momentarily, but the probability that he's going to get taken out is extremely high. And it's actually the pro-social chimp who's strong and fearless, let's say, that's much more likely to have a stable reign, let's say. So you can even see that in chimps. So I'm leery of the, CEOs equal psychopath argument. It's like, well, yeah, they're competitive, but they're conscientious. So that ameliorates the psychopathy, right? Like a disagreeable, conscientious person is really useful to have around, because they will tell you exactly what they think, because they don't care if they hurt your feelings. And that's kind of harsh. They will tell you, man, you'll know. But if they're conscientious, you can trust them. So,
yeah, I was thinking of again Christopher Boehm's book, because he has a section on essentially the practice of capital punishment amongst these hunter-gatherer groups. If the bully, the free rider, if this guy is just so disruptive, they just take him out on a hunting expedition and they come back without him. But
right, exactly.
But it turns out it's pretty hard to kill somebody if you don't have a gun or a big modern knife or something like that. It takes quite an effort, especially if he's a big, massive, muscular, athletic male. So part of the group thing, in addition to distributing the guilt over killing somebody, well, we are all in on it. So, okay, no one person is responsible. But also you kind of need that many people to make it happen.
Right. Well, you can be sure that, look, a great hunter, let's say, might become a leader in a hunter-gatherer group. But part of what makes him a great hunter is the fact that he shares. I mean, he hunts, but he has to share. And that's also to his benefit, because then if someone else hunts and is successful, he gets his share. But so there's the aggression that goes along with hunting and the dominance that goes along with maybe the seeking of status in that particular domain. But no complex human hierarchy is sustainable without reciprocity. And that's why the Marxist criticisms of hierarchy as only based in power, they're just wrong. It's just not the case. When a hierarchy degenerates, then it becomes based on power. Any hierarchy, it could be a creative hierarchy, it could be a competency hierarchy. If it's power, then it's degenerated. It's become the evil tyrant, and then it's time for a revolution. And so, the revolutionary Marxist types can take that fundamental truth, which is that sometimes it's time for a revolution, and that's when power dominates. And they can use that as a motivator because it speaks to us very deeply. But it's very dangerous to apply that to situations where what's producing hierarchical position is multifactorial. And no one in their right mind, if they think about it, as far as I'm concerned, can say that the functional hierarchies that characterize most social organizations in the West, they're just not based on power. That's just wrong. Plumbers, competency. Lawyers, competency. It might be dominance and assertiveness and even a lack of empathy among prosecutors, for example. You have to have a killer instinct. But it's competence, it's ability to do the job. And as soon as that stops being the case, then it is time for the revolution. But
this problem of inequality, the Gini index, which you're familiar with, it's decreasing between countries because poor countries like India and China are becoming wealthier. So they're closing that gap with, say, the United States and other Western democracies. But within the Western democratic countries, the inequality is increasing to the extent that could be a problem, as you described earlier. What's the solution? How do you feel about, say, universal basic income or something along those lines? I used to think it was just crazy that the government could just cut everybody a check, but in fact, now twice in the United States in the last calendar year, the government has done just that. Apparently, the government can cut checks and pile up a huge amount of debt. And according to my modern monetary theory economics friends, the government can do that. It's not going to lead to runaway inflation like it did in the 30s in Germany or 20s in Germany. That, in fact, with modern monetary theory, the government is not like a corporation that must keep a balanced budget. In fact, it can run huge deficits indefinitely and just kick it down the road indefinitely, and we can pull people up by just giving them money.
Well, be interesting to see what happens to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a bet that you can't inflate fiat currencies without a cost. And Bitcoin keep going up, and I think they'll keep going up exactly for this reason. Now, it could be, though, that because we're increasing productivity at such a staggering rate, we might be able to inflate the monetary system without producing inflation, right? As long as we don't inflate the currency more than we're increasing productivity, look, you can buy a TV way cheaper than you could 10 years ago, but the TV is also incalculably better. And so there is some flexibility. And let's go back to the universal basic income idea. The problem for me is that it probably doesn't solve the problem. It only solves the problem if you think that poverty is caused by lack of money. And one of the causes of poverty is lack of money. But poverty is a multidimensional phenomena. There are many forms of poverty, and you can ameliorate some of them with money, but many of them you can't. So, for example, for conscientious people, it's the joblessness that's the problem. Like, conscientious people will tear themselves into pieces if they're not in a harness. So you give them money, that'll just shame them. That's all. And you can say, well, no, people don't think like that. It's just, yes, conscientious people think exactly like that. And they value their enslavement to the community. They see that as a noble calling and service. And it's a primary source of motivation to be of use, you know? And so universal basic income doesn't do that. Now, if you're an artist type, let's say, and relatively low in conscientiousness, but high in openness, you might think, oh, this is a bonanza, man. I've got $1,000 a month or $1,200 a month. I can rent a cheap apartment in some ratty city and start improving it. And who cares if I'm in shackles? You know, I'll do my art. I'll make my music. But Christ, you got to be a creative person to do that. You know, and that's probably you're not. It's not likely because it's rare. And so, the real problem with inequality, I think, in some sense, is dignity of positioning for many, many people. It's like, no, there has to be a place for someone that everyone else and them values. And that's a way more intractable problem than, well, let's make sure everybody doesn't starve, which is also a good thing to solve. Don't get me wrong, you know, and we are solving that incredibly quickly across the world because, you know, people are being, what is it, 200,000 people a day right now are being lifted out of absolute poverty. And it's been the case every day for the last 20 years. It's stunning. So, and, you know, I also do, would it be a good idea to distribute money like that? You know, you can imagine that it would have very complicated consequences. Who knows? Who knows what it would do? I mean, I don't know. There's these arguments, for example, that the welfare state is one of the things that destroyed the integrity of the Black family. Now, you know, I know the arguments. Are they true? I don't know if they're true. I don't know how much families are held together by brute necessity. I don't know how necessary that is. I do know that fatherlessness is a major problem, right? Children in families that lack a father do worse on virtually every outcome. It's a real problem. And I don't know what makes fathers necessary, you know, to hold a marriage together or to even make marriage a desirable state. We don't know any of this. So,
of course, we're talking about on average. I mean, you can find examples where people were, like my wife was raised by a single mom and she's fine. But what you're talking about collectively, we're talking about like the Black family problem in America for the last 50 years. That's just kind of a cohort we're talking about, not individuals. So there is that distinction.
Yeah,
in part, there's a basic
lots of good single mothers.
Yeah,
it's just harder, right?
It's a lot harder, and it's hard, you know, just economically. You know, it's just two incomes in one household is just easier. You know, financially.
Well, and also the division of responsibility for the children.
Labor,
it's a brutal job to have children. It's unbelievably demanding. And if you're a single mother, you work and you have your kids. It's like you're swamped, and you tend to be easy pickings for predatory men too, and that's not good.
Yeah, I wonder if another possible solution would be something like what Roosevelt did in the 30s with the WPA and all the other alphabetic departments that made work for people. So it's
I think infrastructure development is the best. I think infrastructure development is the best equalization program for a bunch of reasons. So, first of all, everyone benefits from infrastructure development. It can't be hoarded it can't be distributed unequally. You know, maybe you don't have a car and you can't use the roads, but the trucks still deliver your groceries with the road. So infrastructure development benefits everyone, and it can't be hoarded. So that's a huge plus. Plus, infrastructure is built by working class people. So that's a huge plus as well. And so from my way of thinking, investing in increasing the efficiency and also the beauty, because I think that's important as well, of the public infrastructure, that's the right focus. That would serve the disenfranchised better than any other solution that I can think of. So hopefully that'll, you know, that's something we could set our minds to. And
let's talk about religious truths, because that comes up a lot in your books, and I'm a great interest to me as well. In terms of religious truths, here's the example I use, like Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, did someone named Jesus of Nazareth actually live? And was he really crucified? I think most historians, including my atheist historian friends who study this, say, yeah, they're probably very, very good evidence someone named Jesus existed. And, the Romans crucified everybody for anything. So, good chance he was also crucified. You could put a Bayesian analysis on them. My priors are high for Jesus' existence and crucifixion. But then you slide toward, well, was he resurrected from the dead after 3 days? And then did he ascend to heaven? And he did all of this for us. That is, he died so our sins would be forgiven. Something like that. Now, on that last one, that would be purely in the religious truth. It's you accept Jesus as the Messiah or you don't. Christians do, Jews and Muslims don't. There's no set of arguments that Christians can make that say rabbis and imams don't know the arguments, and if they only knew the argument that this theologian just made, they'd become Christians and accept Jesus as their Savior. They know the arguments. They just don't accept them because that's not in the realm of objective truth. This is just a pure religious truth. And now the resurrection part, I would say, 100 billion people have lived and died before us. Not one has come back from the dead, except maybe one, Jesus. And if he did, then we could put a number on it. Chances of this happening are 100 billion to 1. The ECRI principle, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is the evidence commensurate with the 100 billion to 1? No, it's not even ordinary evidence. It's biblically internal. There's no external sources from the Roman scribes or Jewish scribes to describe, oh my God, I saw this person and, oy vey, Jesus, you've come back, or nothing like that externally from the Bible. So there, we're kind of in the middle there. But then I got to thinking, what if it should have never been taken literally in the first place? What if that's not what the story means? And this brings me to the way you read literature, and particularly the Bible, in a mythic sense. So let me just say the way I wrote this. What if the story was never meant to be considered literally true? What if it's a metaphorical truth or a mythic truth in which readers might be inspired to bear your own cross, or admonished not to be crucified by your enemies, or warned not to resurrect bad habits, or encouraged to be born again by starting their life anew after a troubling past? Or maybe it's a literary truth, like when William Jennings Bryan famously gave his Cross of Gold speech. We shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. So in this sense, he's speaking metaphorically. So what if Christians have been misreading this story from the beginning? It was never meant to be literal. Like when Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is within you, maybe what he meant was we're supposed to create a heaven on earth here. It's not a place to go. Like there's this other, ontologically real place. It's in your mind. We're supposed to create better societies on earth by working to help the poor and that sort of thing. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
That simple topic.
Yes. You've written a few things on this.
Well, it seems to me, I believe that our society is nested inside a story. I think our personalities are nested inside a story. And so when I think about identity, technically, let's say, identity is, who are you, you're a series of nested entities. So we're sitting here talking, so we're doing that. We're engaged in it, so we're actually making the motor movements that are associated with talking. We're discussing ideas so the motor movements are set inside this other domain, which is the discussion of ideas. We're discussing ideas for a particular purpose, while you and I are both academics and public intellectuals, and we're concerned about education. And we're interested in ideas, so we're trying to educate ourselves, but we're trying to educate other people. And why are we doing that? Well, because hypothetically, there might be some practical reasons. That's gainful employment, but we also, at least in principle, think that's part of being a good citizen, let's say. And that is nested inside this idea that you should be a good person. And then that's nested inside, well, then it starts to get murky because we don't understand the metaphysical reach of being a good person. I would say being a good person is nested inside the hero myth, and the hero myth is deep embedded in our biology. It's the manifestation of the central integrated nature of a well-developed human being, and we pledge allegiance to that proposition when we note that we all have inalienable rights. Right, that's part of our inalienable value, transcendent value, because it's outside of everything else we do. And then that's nested in something like the nature of the world, the cosmos itself. And it's out in those farther reaches that you encounter the religious realm. And it's inevitable. There's no way around it, or that's my sense of my sense of it. You're stuck in that narrative one way or another. And you're stuck in it because, well, it does matter to you whether you like it or not, that you're a good person. You'll torture yourself if you're not. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll stop doing the things you torture yourself about, but I have never met anyone who had control over their conscience. And conscience can go astray and torture people more than it should. It's not an infallible mechanism, but we're subject to this. We're subject to it. That's why I think Nietzsche was wrong fundamentally. He said people will be able to create their own values because we've destroyed this metaphysical reality. And God was the cornerstone of that. We've destroyed God, and that's a catastrophe in Nietzsche's reading. And he thought we'd have to create our own values. It's like, well, we can't. That's why I'm an admirer of Jung, for example, and of Freud, but of Jung more particularly, because of Jung's trenchant critique of Nietzsche, which was fundamentally, no, we can't create our own values. We're actually the handmaidens of our values. They're there. We're subject to them. And what we need to do is to act and discover them and act in accordance with them. I think when you discover your own values, you have a revelation. And that does come with the force of religious conviction. And we don't understand that. And we should speak scientifically here, you and I, because that's our domain of expertise. And this is one thing that the atheist community does not take seriously. And I would say that's true for the rationalists as well, people like Pinker. And I'm an admirer of Pinker. He's a clear thinker, and I like his Enlightenment orientation. But he tends to dismiss in his writings, well, many of the things that are central in my writings. Religious thinking and literature and the domain of art they're kind of like secondary consequences of the development of our intellect, where for me, they're the root source of our being. They're fundamental. And we have this religious instinct and the capacity for religious experience. And we live on that. We can't live without it. We despair. We sink into depression. We sink into nihilism and self-destruction. And that's true for everyone, atheist or not. You need beauty. You need music. You need a connection with the transcendent. You find that in love, maybe. It isn't secondary. And so there's this problem of the religious, which faces us, and it is at the outskirts of our identity. So I would say, look, fundamentally, you take a messianic, heroic, or a satanic adversarial stance to life. It's something like that. And that's good and evil. And those are very real for me. They're perhaps the most real of things. To the degree that you serve good, you serve life. It's life more abundant. There's no better phrasing of that. And to the degree that you're possessed by the adversarial spirit, you work for the destruction of things. You're resentful and bitter. You shake your fist at God or the dead cosmos. It doesn't matter from a motivational perspective. And I've seen too in my clinical practice time and time again when people were in dire straits, like suicide, life and death situations, terrible family circumstances, multiple generations of dense lies, sadism, horrible situations. The only language that ever sufficed was the language of good and evil and religious language, because you get so deep at times into things that, well, that's the language that suffices. And so you laid out the improbabilities, and yes, obviously, and who knows what to make of them. And there is that argument, right? That rationalist argument, the Bayesian argument. But there's something to the story of Christianity that's, well, first of all, absolutely central to our culture. Like the matrix out of which Christianity emerged, even biologically speaking, is the same matrix out of which our notion of intrinsic individual rights emerged. And that's associated with the idea that of the eternal dignity of the soul. And that idea, that's really old, man. And people work to develop it and to separate it from power for centuries. Like you see this happening in Egypt, where the notion of sovereignty was abstracted away from the holder of the sovereignty, abstracted away from any particular pharaoh. It became a concept in and of itself. It was Osiris and Horus united. Brilliant, brilliant philosophical conceptualization. And then that was granted to each individual. And that was a process that took thousands and thousands of years of self-analysis and self-discovery. And so, look, that leaves us with the conundrum that you just described. We have this, the easy way out. The easy way out is to say, and it's reasonable to say what you just said, which is, well, these stories, they're a different kind of truth. I think of them as a meta-truth. Like Dostoevsky is more true than history. His books are more true than history because they're distilled. They're like they're averages of occurrences. And so they never happened, but they happen all the time. It's both of those at the same time. And the biblical stories are like that. And they are mysterious in their depth. The story of Cain and Abel, which is very short, a paragraph long, it's so dense that you could spend your whole life untangling it and you'd still find more. And that's probably because it was part of this ancient oral tradition stretching back God only knows how many tens of thousands of years. And we don't know the process by which information has to be organized to be transmitted orally across those vast expanses of time. And the biblical story as a narrative is also unbelievably compelling psychologically, because you see what happens in the story is that people pursue heaven on earth continually. They see their salvation in the establishment of an ideal state, something that's probably still being played out in the Middle East. And the Israelites chase the ideal state, and on their way to it, they idolatrize and collapse. And that happens repeatedly. And as that happens, the notion of the ideal transforms from something that's sociological and political into something that's psychological and spiritual. So now it becomes that the promised land is no longer a political state where you are sovereign and you dominate your enemies, let's say, but a mode of individual being. And that's embedded in the figure of Christ, for better or worse. It's embedded in the prophets in the Old Testament as well, right? They're like precursors, developmental precursors to this arguably more full-fledged idea. And the other thing that I found about the biblical stories in particular, this really shocked me. I never expected it, was that the more you investigate them, the deeper and more mysterious they become. There's always more to them in ways that are.
Are you discovering more? Are you discovering more meanings in them, or are you imposing your own meanings from your own thoughts and readings of other sources?
Well, look, you never know, right? That's a big problem. And so how do you combat that? Well, I tried to do that in Maps of Meaning. I never relied on a single. What you do to combat that is you look at the phenomena from different methodological perspectives. And you look for emergent evidence across methodologies for the phenomena in question. And so that's why I start the book with a terribly dense voyage through neuropsychology. It's like, look, how are our brains organized? Well, they're organized so that there's a huge circuit devoted to actions in explored and understood territory. And there's a huge circuit devoted to the analysis of what we don't expect and what is mysterious. And that's roughly equivalent to the hemispheric specialization. And so it's a reality that's so palpable that it shaped our physiological development. So we have explored territory and unexplored territory. That's roughly order and chaos. And I define order it's a technical definition. You're in explored territory when what you do produces the result you desired. And so what that does is not only get you what you want, it validates the the perceptual schema within which you're operating. And that keeps you stable. And I would also say technically, like your emotions are regulated when your behavior produces the results you desire, because you know that your axiomatic presuppositions, many of which are invisible, are actually operative in that situation. And you will fight like mad to maintain the domain where that's possible. That accounts for your territoriality. You know, that's why chimps don't like interlopers, because they add uncertainty to the dominance relationships, and that destabilizes their ability to predict and to get what they want. We're very much like that, very much like that. And so then, you know, the argument is, well, explored territory and unexplored territory are symbolized with personifications. That's how they manifest themselves to us. And it's out of that we're trying to solve the problem as a human race. How do we make explored territory as stable as possible and as sustainable? And what do we do about the fact that we eternally don't know things? And the answer isn't make everything hyper predictable. And the answer isn't let everything dissolve into chaos because we don't know everything. The answer is a mode of being that allows us to maintain a beneficial interplay between both. And that's associated with the hero story. And that's associated with the idea of sacrifice. And like, look, the Christian story in part is the story of the ultimate sacrifice. And you say, okay, well, why should I lend any credence to that? Well, it's simple in some sense. Do you think there are things worth sacrificing for? Well, obviously you do, because you've sacrificed all sorts of things to become educated, to take the path that you've taken. You think that you'll pay a price to take this particular path because it's a good path, to the degree that you're a good man. You make the sacrifices necessary to do that. Then the question arises instantly, as soon as you accept that. Well, what is the ultimate good that can be pursued then? That's the target of sacrifice. And then what is the ultimate sacrifice? And it's pretty clear that the ultimate sacrifice is something like sacrificing yourself for the benefit of others. And that's what you see played out in Christianity. And I don't see that there's a way out of that conundrum. Like, is there a more profound form of sacrifice? And the Christian story takes it to its archetypal limit. It's like the innocent man sacrifices himself for the eternal benefit of others. Well, is that a moral truth or not? And is it a fundamental moral truth? And then if it is a fundamental moral truth, does that have any, what would you say? Is there any cosmological significance to that? Well, who knows, right? Because we don't understand our place in the universe. Like maybe we're random bits of dust on a mote in an isolated subsection of a universe that doesn't give a damn. Or maybe we're the only bearers of self-consciousness that exist, and being itself is dependent on us. We don't know. You know, and I actually think the latter possibility is more frightening than the former.
Maybe. Well, that's why I like to visit both observatories and cathedrals, European cathedrals in particular. My wife's from Cologne, so the big dome is there, and it is magnificent. I have to say, even though I'm an atheist, I feel totally moved and almost spiritual when I'm in there. We light candles and the stained glass windows, and different times of the day the light comes in, and I totally get it. I can only imagine living 500 years ago and think this is it. You know, it's very moving. So
it's really worthwhile looking at that. I mean, the reason I started to look at this was because of what music did to me. I thought, look what happens. What the hell's going on? It's a profound sense of awe and engagement. And it's not conscious. It's not under my control. It happens to me. Okay, so we have these cathedrals, and people put a tremendous amount of effort into those. And they signify something, right? They're lattices of stone and light, that's impossible, right? To make a lattice of stone and light. That's really difficult technically. They're like a forest with the sun shining through the trees. The stained glass is beautiful in a way that's sort of super sensory. It's more than anything you would normally experience in the outside world. The music amplifies that. And then there's the fact of the proximity of death and sacrifice. All of that's built. The cathedral is an argument of sorts. It's an embodied argument of sorts. And it's also an undeniable argument, and you can tell that by what happens to you when you walk into one. And then you take it apart with your rational mind and you say, well, can I accept this? And you balk constantly. And no wonder. But that still leaves you with the problem of the initial movement and the religious instinct. Like, I don't think that you can be a biologically oriented psychologist in the beginnings of the 21st century and deny the centrality of the religious instinct. I don't believe that's possible. So, and we don't know what to make of it.
I think theists and atheists both, and I've done this on both ends, take these things too literally. That's why I'm pushing this idea of a religious truth, metaphorical truth, mythic truth, and so on. When I was a Christian at Pepperdine, I believed it all. And, I was an evangelical. Pepperdine was a Church of Christ school. I took courses in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the life of Jesus, and the writings of C.S. Lewis. We read everything C.S. Lewis wrote. He not only wrote that 6-volume children's series, The Chronicles of Narnia, he wrote a 3-volume science fiction trilogy. It wasn't very good as far as science fiction goes, but he was better for kids. In any case, his nonfiction stuff was quite powerful. But then, later I became an atheist, and then in the 80s, I went through my Joseph Campbell phase. I read The Hero with a Thousand Faces and his 3-volume book on myths, and then, of course, I watched the whole Bill Moyers PBS series on him where he explained Star Wars. That's the hero's journey. And I thought, okay. So then I had kind of a newfound respect for the Jesus story. And then, with Skeptic, when we started Skeptic, I started getting articles from atheists that was going, okay, so the biblical story of the flood or this or that could be explained by natural forces. It was a volcano, or it was a hurricane, or it was a plague of locusts because of the climactic change. Even that Jesus, when he was on the cross, he didn't actually die. He was in a coma. And then when he was in the cold tomb, he was preserved, and they gave him this ointment that kept him going. And then he and Mary then go full Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code. He and Mary Magdalene moved to France and had children. Here we are. Okay. But I thought, we published a few of those. I thought these are kind of interesting, attempting to make a natural explanation for an apparently supernatural phenomenon. But again, I think it misses the point of the story. The point of the story is not to be taken literally. No. And so both theists, like when I debate theists, they insist, that the Jesus story is real and that the Jews and Muslims, they're just wrong. Although my Jewish friends, like I asked Ben Shapiro this on his Sunday special, why don't you accept the Jesus resurrection story? And so on. He says, that's not the Messiah that the Old Testament describes. And then he described what the Old Testament says that the Messiah will do, which is literally create kind of a new heavens on earth in this, in Israel and so on. And that's not what happened. So that's not the guy, And so here Jews believe in the Old Testament, the Abraham God. They even think there's a Messiah. They just don't think Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, But again, that's all like you're taking it too literally, Jonah and the great fish and so on. No, this is a story of rebirth. And then I discovered the 1890 ghost dance. You probably know this story pretty well. In 1890, as the West was closing and the U.S. government had put most Native Americans on reservations, their cultures were dying, the buffaloes were mostly wiped out. And in 1890, this sage, or whatever you want to call him, named Wovoka, had a vision that, this was all going to change, that the U.S. government we're going to push away our oppressors, the buffalo were going to come back. And he wore this shirt that he thought was impervious to the white man's bullets. And for days and days, they did this dance that went on and on and on. And of course, the reservation government officials are like, oh my God, this is not good. We have to put a stop to this. The whole thing ended disastrously at the massacre at Wounded Knee. It's a terrible story. But then I read an anthropologist named James Mooney, who wrote a book in 1896, so just a couple of years after the event, called The Ghost Dance Religion and the Sioux Outbreak of 1890. So here's how he describes it, which gets to, I think, the point you were making. And when the race lies crushed and groaning beneath an alien yoke, how natural is the dream of a Redeemer and Arthur, who shall return from exile or awake from some long sleep to drive out the usurper and win back for his people what they have lost. The hope becomes a faith, and the faith becomes a creed of priests and prophets, until the hero is a god and the dream a religion, looking to some great miracle of nature for its culmination and accomplishment. The doctrines of the Hindu avatar, the Hebrew Messiah, the Christian millennium, and the Hussainin of the Indian ghost dance are essentially the same and have their origin in a hope and longing common to all humanity.
No doubt the case.
I think that's a lot of what your writings are about, I think. I'm not sure that you take the resurrection as literally true and Jesus has really died for our sins. But I've never asked you, and I don't know if you've ever stated what exactly you believe about that.
I guess I would say that I've stated what I believe as clearly as I possibly can in what I've written. You know, I can't say that in some sense there's a secret hiding behind that I haven't revealed. You know, what I'm doing when I'm writing is not so much saying what I think as thinking, right? I'm thinking on the page and I'm pushing my thought as far as it'll go. And so those are the conclusions that I've managed. You know, you talked about the Bayesian improbability of the resurrection story, and I countered that with a description of the potency and validity of the religious narrative and its necessity. And that doesn't mean we resolved that. There's a tension there, because the tension would be, well, we obviously believe that in the narrative domain, tell me if I'm wrong about what you believe, but there's obviously literature of different depth. And we make a distinction between great literature and lesser literature. And I think we could say that great literature bears a more profound relationship to the truth. And the greater the literature, the more profound the truth. Well, I don't think there is any greater literature than the biblical literature taken as a whole, partly because all of our other literature in the West has come out of it. It's the source of it. And so it's a great truth of some sort. Well, what does that mean? Well, I don't know what it means, or I don't know any more than I've already surmised, and I have to live with that tension. I can't resolve it. You know that because of our moral ambivalence, each of us, we're less committed to our task than we might be. We're plagued by existential doubts. We're held back by our resentment and our bitterness. We get in our own way. We have an ambivalent sense of whether we're worthy as individuals or as a species, for that matter. And so we stumble forward half crippled, and maybe we move towards the light regardless, but we're not all in by any stretch of the imagination as individuals or as a culture or as any culture. So then you ask yourself, well, what would you be like if you were all in? And then what would a culture be like if it was composed of people who were nothing but all in? If we devoted everything we had to the task at hand, to the highest good, and we moved away from our adversarial identification and our nihilism and our desire for destruction and our willingness to wallow in misery and to perpetuate it. Well, what would we do? Would we defeat death? Would we bring about immortal life? Would we resurrect the dead? Who knows what we could do? I don't see that human possibility is bounded in any realistic sense. What we've already accomplished is absolutely beyond comprehension. And there are many things that we don't understand at all. And many of those things are going to be revolutionary. They're going to change the way we look at everything. And so, well, then I wonder too, well, there have been people of varying different moral ability throughout the entire corpus throughout human society. How does immense moral good manifest itself in the world when it actually makes itself real? And that is the story of Christ, mythological or otherwise. That is the story. And there is this insistence, and this is an insistence among sophisticated Christian thinkers, that the moral world and the objective world touch in that story. And the thing is, the moral world and the objective world, they do touch, because we live in the moral world and the objective world. And so they do touch. And so I don't know what to do with that either. Like are good and evil they're realities of a sort. Well, are they the deepest realities? Like, I think they're the deepest realities. As objective as I am and as scientifically oriented as I am, I still believe that good and evil, that the battle between good and evil is the defining characteristic of reality. And because it's the only it's the only thing I've ever found that suffices to explain the Holocaust, for example, which I've studied very seriously to my own detriment, I would say, because I've tried to understand it, like, and from the perspective of the perpetrator.
Yes, you have to do that. I've done that too, and that does put a different perspective on things. So let's think about that for a minute. I've been kind of rethinking my thoughts on this after I read Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday. He makes the case there that we are not as gullible as a lot of cognitive psychologists have made us out to be, like Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, how subject we are to all these confirmation biases and motivated reasoning and on and on. But in fact, most gurus and cult leaders are not successful. Most religious leaders are not successful. Even Jesus failed to start a new religion, which wasn't his intention probably in the first place. And even Paul, barely got it going. It wasn't until the 4th century Romans, when Constantine converted, that it started to pick up steam. And he calculates if you only go like 1.5% growth rate for 1,500 years, you get several tens of millions without much conversion at all. And that we hear about the crazy cults like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate and so on, but those are pretty rare. I mean, if you think of the thousands of self-help groups and people like Tony Robbins or whatever, just trying to help people, they don't turn into cults because most people don't fall for that kind of thing. Anyway, he has a chapter on the Nazis. So his argument, let me just give me your thoughts on this. His argument is that, so the question to try to answer is, how do you convert a group, a people, a nation of highly educated, cultured, Western, and so on, the home of Beethoven and Goethe and so on, and turn them into goose-stepping Nazis? So his answer is they didn't. They never had a majority. Hitler came to power in a minority party for various reasons, the way it was structured, and then once they took power, then they squelched the press and Hitler made himself dictator and so on, and the Reichstag fire, so declared emergency, that shut everything down. And that, in fact, if you look at the way he kind of structures some of the studies about even the anti-Semitism, his rantings about the Jews mostly only appealed to people who were already pretty anti-Semitic. And particularly with the extermination part of the Nazi ideology, most Germans were not on board with that. But by the time they implemented that, say 1941, 42, it was too late. I mean, if you dissented, you're going off to the concentration camp. And there was no free press. So you get this dual thing of pluralistic ignorance, the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else is on board, even though none of them actually buy into it, or most of them don't. On top of which you have censorship of free speech, free press, and so on. So no one can speak up and say, hey, the emperor has no clothes. Oh, yeah. Okay, now we all say what we all can see, right? So that's what kind of held it aloft for about 12 years, of the regime, those two factors. And so anyway, he also shows studies showing that most of Goebbels' propaganda was not believed by most Germans. But they just had no choice. And the Germans that wanted to get what was really happening, they piped in BBC News to find out how the war was really going, which is usually not very well. Anyway, so the argument there is that we're not that gullible, and that most Germans were not bad people. And in fact, it was only a matter of years before Germany became one of the most peaceful places on earth. Right? They're pretty much against this sort of thing. And again, my wife's from Germany. She says from an early age we are just pounded like, we are never doing this again. This was a huge mistake. We're not going to ever let anybody. And that's why they have those pretty draconian laws about fringe groups and neo-Nazi groups and stuff. They're going to nip that in the bud right away. So, so anyway, that's the argument. I just thought I'd get your thoughts on that.
Well, there isn't anything in that. I think there are multiple ways of looking at what happened in Nazi Germany and that are credible. The argument you laid out, it doesn't get at what was of central interest to me, I guess, or what possessed me. And I wasn't really interested in it so much as a sociological phenomenon. I was interested in what it took to have someone who was already ruined carry a sack of wet salt on their breaking back from one side of the camp compound and back. What you had to be like to do that to someone. What possessed you. And that's what led me into the mythological domain, I would say. Because that's an adversarial motivation. It's revenge against God to do that. It's spitting in the face of being itself. It's motivated by resentment and bitterness, and it's understandable because life is very hard and often very unfair. And we have antinatalists who believe that consciousness is so unbearable that the moral thing to do is to cease reproducing. And it's a fringe philosophical position, but it's not indefensible. I think it's indefensible because if implemented, it worsens everything. But as a set of propositions, I mean, Dostoevsky explores that in depth in The Brothers Karamazov. Ivan states, how could you possibly posit the existence of a benevolent God, or we could say benevolent cosmos for atheist types, or benevolent being, in the face of all the catastrophes that make up human existence? Why not take revenge against it like Cain? Like, my sacrifices went unrewarded. I'm going to destroy what's valued. And that motivation is understandable. It's understandable.
So that describes the SS guard in the camp in Auschwitz. What do you make of someone like Eichmann, paper pushing bureaucrat, and the banality of evil?
Well, I talked about that a little bit obliquely, let's say, in Rule 3 and Beyond Order. Do not hide things in the fog. It's like realization is generally an effortful process. Like, you're alerted to your own wrongdoing by glimmerings of conscience, let's say, feelings of shame and doubt. But you have to unpack those to find out exactly what you're doing wrong. And that's really hard. It's effortful. And so you can just not do it. And the way you don't do it is you take refuge in your blind conformity. And that's part of that pluralistic ignorance. And I suppose that's one of the flaws of the argument that you laid out. It's like, yeah, people were pluralistically ignorant, but how much of that was turning a blind eye? And you can maintain a very high level of plausible ignorance by turning a blind eye. And in the ancient Egyptian story that I'm so enamored with, the story of Osiris and his degeneration. So he's the god of the state. Osiris degenerates because he turns a blind eye to the machinations of his evil brother. He could know, but he decides not to. And that's a moral sin in my estimation. And so out of the story that you told with regards to pluralistic ignorance, I would add a psychological component is, how much could have people known if they would have allowed themselves to investigate instead of refusing it? So, with Freud, you have the idea of repression. You know something uncomfortable and you suppress it, and it's there and you can rediscover it. But it's not exactly right, because what happens is that you have a hint that something's rotten in the state of Denmark, and that elicits an exploratory tendency and an avoidance tendency as well. And you can just leave it unpacked. And then the rot that you're detecting subliminally, let's say, accumulates around you. And if it accumulates enough, it turns into the dragon of chaos. It's like, and then you get the situation that you described. By the time that you can no longer turn a blind eye, the thing that you avoided is so monstrous that you cannot prevail against it. So I would still say, even if that entire explanatory story is correct, it misses the moral culpability element, which is, just how much could have you known? And I have some sympathy for this. Believe me, I understand why people are blind to the horrors of malevolence, let's say, because malevolence, when confronted, is traumatizing. And you see that in the post-traumatic stress disorder literature. It's contact with malevolence that traumatizes people. The contact with someone who really, really wants to hurt them. And they're shocked by that can even exist. It's terrible. especially when you start looking into it. It undoes you, it unglues you, especially if you are a naive believer in the, untrammeled goodness of human beings or even of existence. In any case, you turn a blind eye. And ancient stories warn about this all the time. You turn a blind eye and then things go rotten under your sovereignty. And by the time you're awake, it's too late. And that isn't, you've abdicated your responsibility. And that happens bit by bit, right? That's the other thing about it that's so pernicious. It's like people ask me, for example, why I chose this bill in Canada to die as a hill to die on, let's say. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, you're going to say no. If you ever say no, you're going to say no to something trivial, because things that go astray bit by bit. And so there's virtually never a sliding point where everyone says, oh, no. It's like, well, this much more. Well, I'm uneasy, but I accept it. Well, then it's a little worse and you're a little lesser. And then it's this much more, And the probability that will happen is there all the time. And it's as moral citizens that who have a moral obligation to see what's in front of us, that we hold that at bay always. It's with our eyes open. That's why Horus in the Egyptian story is the eye. He's not thinking. It's not thought. It's attention. See. It's the willingness to turn your eyes to the phenomena and see what's there. And the Egyptians regarded that as part of what was redemptive. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Conscious attention as the source of eternal redemption. Right. That's the human story. I mean, look at us. We're half visual cortex.
Yes.
Right.
And in Holocaust studies, there's something of a debate, at least there was, between intentionalists and functionalists. To what extent did Hitler intend to exterminate European Jewry from the very beginning, maybe even all the way back to when he was in World War I or in the 1920s or whatever? Functionalists argue that it was kind of a sliding scale in which things built up over time. Clearly, Hitler was anti-Semitic, as were quite a few Germans and Poles and others in Europe. But it wasn't really until they implemented the euthanasia program in the early 30s and started building the KL system. There were hundreds and hundreds of camps all throughout Germany. So people could, as you said, could not have not noticed it. They had to turn a blind eye. But then the Catholic, I think it was 1937, the Catholic Church spoke out against the euthanasia program because they expanded it to not just killing handicapped people and so on, but their own citizens and people that were so-called work shy. They just didn't want to work, for the Nazis or whatever. And so that's when, and we have
characterized as parasites.
Yes, we have a memo from Hitler to Himmler saying, okay, we're not going to speak of this again. Don't put this in writing. These are, just verbal commands. And then, when they started building the death camps, that was really, all 6 death camps, the major ones, were not in Germany. They were in Poland. And so, again, far from the prying eyes of the German press, what was left of it, or the prying eyes of Germans who maybe were not on board with the exterminationist program. And anti-Semitism was pretty high in Poland. So, so maybe people went along with it or more eagerly turned a blind eye, something like that. So you get that kind of sliding scale where, of course, in hindsight, we think, well, we should have spoken up. And some people did speak up and, they got sent off to Dachau and some of these other political camps. They weren't exterminated, but they were silenced that way.
Yeah, well, the cost of speaking up is extraordinarily high, and you bear it, as an individual right then and there. And so many people think you're wrong because you're waking them up to truths they don't want to face. And so there's an unbelievable price to pay for communicating your alert attention. Now, Jung spent a lot of time assessing what went on with Hitler, and I think his analysis is brilliant. So his hypothesis was essentially this, that the Germans had been humiliated and defeated after World War I, and were they also bore the burden of a vengeful peace treaty, and the whole population was also brutalized, especially the men who'd served in the trenches. And then they underwent terrible economic privation in the 1920s through hyperinflation. I mean, it was a complete bloody catastrophe. And so there was this burning desire for, wounded pride, shame, resentment, guilt, all burning away. And Hitler, who was a master orator, was also very attentive to the crowd. So now imagine that what he's doing, imagine it's like imagine the satanic ritual abuse narratives that were elicited from children in the 1980s by overzealous police investigators. So you prime the children with questions, and the questions form a narrative pattern, and the imagination of the children fills in the narrative pattern and then delivers it to the interlocutors. That's what happened with Hitler and the German people. So he would say something that struck him in an emotional way, and the crowd would either respond or not. And if the crowd responded, then he would say that more. And then his imagination filled in the gaps. And so Jung's notion was that Hitler explicitly fed back to the German population its own shadow. And the shadow was developed as a consequence of all the horrors of the first part of the 20th century, combined with, general human malevolence and the proclivity to voluntary blindness. And so Hitler became the spokesman for the dark soul for the unconscious dark soul of the Germanic people. And I think that's highly plausible, because he that's what a leader does, actually. Now, he did it in a perverse way, I believe, because he was contaminated with too much demand for resentment and power on his own part, something like that. But what a leader should do is reflect back to the crowd its deepest longings. Now, a benevolent leader would do that in a benevolent way, but a malevolent leader could easily capitalize on that, especially in a situation where there was deep resentment. And so Hitler was like a logos gone completely astray. He used his verbal facility in the service of malevolence. And maybe that was because of his own desire for power. But I think that way, I like that explanation, because it gives you this tandem reciprocal relationship between the leader and the populace, and Hitler was a spontaneous speaker and was always attending to the audience. Well, they were informing him, and he was willing to go in the direction of their darkest desires. So let's say, as he continued, he was only speaking more and more to zealots, right? Because the ordinary people, the good ordinary people, wouldn't go to the rallies. And so as he got darker and darker, so did his crowd. And then we know a motivated minority can take over an unmotivated majority.
Fingerspitzgefühl, I think it's called. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but the fingertip feeling for the audience, that he was just a genius at being able to read audiences like that. Yeah.
Well, you can see that. I think you can see that. I mean, you look at these documentary records we have of the Nazi rallies. Like there's something going on there that's quasi-religious. Hitler is in a kind of trance, and so is the audience. Their automatic reactions, and they're in unison. And he was a master of the use of order, symbols of order, and fire. And there's this immense theatricality about it, because the other thing peculiar about him was he was also open. He was a creative person, obsessed with architecture. He was, in his own peculiar way, obviously. I mean, he would classify art into acceptable and forbidden as well, right? So there was this sort of fascist element to his aesthetic taste, but you also can't factor that out of the equation. We talked about the effect of ritual and situation, like the cathedrals, on the human psyche. I mean, the Nazis, and this is something fascism does quite well, it does the nonverbal very well. And so a lot of the force of the argument isn't, you take the arguments apart and you think, no, but the argument was only a small part of what was going on.
Yeah, that film, The Triumph of the Will, Lenny
Riefenstahl.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, phenomenal. I mean, just phenomenal. Why are there neo-Nazis? Why are there not neo-Napoleon and Napoleon soldiers or neo-French warriors from the 19th century or whatever? There's something appealing to young men today, which is why the German state outlaws it. That the logos, the lights, the uniforms, the hats and all that stuff seems to. When my wife moved here from Germany, we're just channel surfing. She's like, "What's with you Americans? Every other documentary is about Hitler and the Nazis. We got over this guy, decades ago." It's like, I don't know. There's a fascination with that particular period of time.
Well, and that fascination is worth delving into, despite the horrors that you find at the bottom of it. mean, it was the use of that fascination that allowed Hitler to do what he did. And it is a fascination, right? See, I think what happens too, and I spent a lot of time talking about this in Maps of Meaning, is so your interest manifests itself in ways you can't control, right? It's the instinct of meaning manifests itself, and then you follow it. That's the spirit Mercurius, right? He's the winged messenger of the gods, and so something brightens up for you, and you follow that, and you find your destiny that way. Jung's notion was that was the manner in which your potential future self manifested itself in the present and pulled you along. And so an example of that would be maybe you're a child and you find someone you admire, and so they sort of glow, and then you mimic them. And it's because the mechanisms in your mind that are propelling you towards maturation find someone who's like you, so they're in the zone of proximal development, but somewhat more advanced. You latch onto them as an idol, let's say, and you mimic them, and that catalyzes your development. So that's the manifestation of interest. Now imagine that you pathologize that by through deceit and self-deception and refusal to attend to what's right in front of you. Well, you make yourself weak because you don't develop well, but you also pathologize that mechanism. And God only knows where it will lead you under those conditions.
I'm looking for this quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. We have the line dividing good and evil. Let me just pull that up for you, because it reminds me of this. Let's see. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. I mean, just to kind of bring this back to where we started. I mean, in a way, you're kind of suggesting that we all have this tension between our inner demons and our better angels, between good and evil. This is Solzhenitsyn's, another one of your favorite authors, is point, right? We can't just lock up the bad people and then the world will be fine. This was Hannah Arendt's point about the banality of evil. You know, there's Eichmann sitting there. He just looks like a regular dude, just some paper-pushing bureaucrat. How did he do this? Well,
she had her title reversed.
She did?
It's really the evil of banality.
Ah, okay, right, yeah.
Yes, it's much more explanatory that way, because the problem with being banal is you don't respect yourself. And then if you can latch onto something of power, that's the bully henchman. It's right. Because you're insufficient in your own eyes, because you're banal, then you're attracted towards displays of power, towards fascist displays of power. And if bullies are bad enough, but bully henchmen, I think, are even worse, because at least the bully's out there on the firing line. The henchmen get all the benefits, or almost all of them, without the risk. And it's not like I'm justifying the bully. I'm not. But the henchmen, I think, in some sense, are even worse. And so the question is, what do you doom yourself to if you remain banal? And I think you doom yourself to an unconscious fascination with unearned power. So in some sense, she had the causal story backwards.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. So
we're not designed to be banal, right? Like we don't respect ourselves then. We're designed to, so to speak, like many of us are designed to bear a heavy burden, right? To be of service to our fellow man. We find meaning in that, deep meaning. And if we're not doing that, then our lives are not deep and meaningful, and then the suffering can easily make us corrupt.
Maybe it's too easy in a large society like ours to hide in the nooks and crannies and be banal without having to be on the front lines and pay the price.
It's very dissatisfying to young people when that's the case. You know, their heart burns, but they have nowhere to go, and they can't tolerate that. Like Piaget, for example, pointed out that, although you never hear this when you study developmental psychology, you have to read Piaget. He pointed out that late adolescents reliably go through a messianic phase, right? They're compelled to change the world. They feel called out to this quasi-messianic destiny, and certainly ideologues are great at harnessing that, but that needs to be placed within what I would say is a proper traditional / religious context. And this is one of the great advantages I truly believe that Christianity has, perhaps not over other faiths. I'm not making that case, but certainly in contrast to ideologies. It's like, well, you harness that messianic spirit to organize and purify, so to speak, your own soul. You don't go over after an external enemy. And there's a heroic battle in that. That's the battle between the adversary and the hero. And that's within, not external. It's within. It's safer that way, much safer. And then you have good citizens if that works out, because they get themselves in order, and more than in order, more than in order. They become masters of chaos as well as order. And that's also what I see as something that's so profound about the biblical narrative, because it insists upon this psychologization of utopia. It becomes a psychological drama, not a political drama. It's a psychological drama. The moral battle takes place within the confines of your own psyche. And I think people know that because they see that they're tortured by their own consciences.
In a way, I guess the long history of civilization, particularly in the last, say, half century or so, has been to find that balance between order and chaos and to structure things to nudge people in the right direction toward channeling their better angels and suppressing their inner demons that are in there in all of us. And we've been getting better at that. Are you optimistic that we're finally understanding the human condition better in order to do that very thing?
There are plenty of reasons for optimism. I'm a great admirer of people like Bjorn Lomborg, and you mentioned Matt Ridley, who wrote Innovation. There are these Enlightenment optimists, let's say.
Yeah, I'm one of those.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and they make a good case, and it's such a lovely case. Look at how much better we're doing. And I talked to Bjorn about this in detail. You can't sell it. It doesn't have a mythic power, the story. And it's a real problem. It's a real problem. It's like, well, what do we want? Incremental improvement. When do we want it? In due time. And fair enough, right? It's prudent. It's exactly what a conservative would recommend in some sense, right? It's incremental progress over a long period of time. But there's a heroic element that's necessary for a compelling political narrative, or spiritual narrative for that matter. And you might say, well, maybe we don't need that. But then I think you take Dostoevsky as a warning. In Notes from Underground, and I've sort of repeated this ad nauseum, but it's such a beautiful point. It's such a great criticism of utopian thinking. Dostoevsky says, look, you got to contend with human nature. If you gave people this guaranteed minimum wage, let's say, and all they had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, and there was nothing but bliss to be found everywhere, or at least the absence of material deprivation, human beings would smash it to pieces with sticks just so that something interesting would happen. And that's right. Like, we're like that. We've got that perverse element that's also associated with our implacability and our adventurousness and our desire for infinite exploration and transformation. And mere accretion of material comfort is not only not going to satisfy that, in some sense, it's going to actively frustrate it. And so then you think, well, what's going to become attractive as an alternative? The Proud Boys, Antifa, where there's the thrill and glory of being on the front line, and the romantic attraction that also holds for young people, and like reasonably so. Who's a more romantic figure, like an Antifa frontline militant or a 7-Eleven clerk?
Right, right. I was looking for that quote from Orwell. He reviewed, I can't find it now. He reviewed Mein Kampf in the 30s in an American publication, in which he said something like, this is the Roosevelt era, so something like what progressives don't understand is that just giving everybody, just the basic elements of what they need to eat and so on is not enough. Hitler understands that people need this, this kind of messianic goal in their lives, and he's captured that in the book and then also in his speeches.
Yeah, well, we're not animals in a zoo. Like we're not camels in a zoo. We're not herbivores. And just because we have enough straw doesn't mean we're going to lose our unbelievable capacity for destructive creation. And we don't know how to harness that. And I've been trying, I suppose, in some sense, to to meet that desire for a call to adventure with what I'm writing and with my lectures, and to use responsibility in this moral domain as a battle that's of sufficient intensity to engage young people in particular property. It's like, get yourself together, see how difficult that is, see what you can do, put yourself together, stop doing the things you know to be wrong, and see what happens. Put yourself together. And there's been an unbelievable response to that. And I think it's harmless in some sense, or as harmless as such things can be, because it is focused. It's like, change you. Leave the other people alone. Or if you want to change them, maybe you can do it through example. But they're not the problem. You have enough problems with yourself.
I found that quote for you here. This is in my book, Heavens on Earth. The utopian quest for perfect happiness was exposed as the flawed goal that it is by George Orwell in his 1940 review of Mein Kampf. Quote, Hitler had grasped the falsity of the hedonistic attitude to life. Nearly all Western thought since the last war, First World War, certainly all progressive thought, has assumed tacitly that human beings desire nothing beyond ease, security, and avoidance of pain. Hitler knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and sacrifice. And then on the broader appeal of fascism and socialism, Orwell added, however they may be as economic theories, fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. The same is probably true of Stalin's militarized version of socialism. All three of the great dictators have enhanced their power by imposing intolerable burdens on their peoples. Whereas socialism and even capitalism in a more grudging way have said to people, I offer you a good time. Hitler has said to them, I offer you struggle, danger, and death. Yeah, trivial
good time, right? A trivial good time. Yeah, something that you'd offer to dependent children who you had very little respect for. It's like, well, what are you complaining about? You've got enough to eat. It's like, fair enough, who wants to starve, right? And so it's even hard to fight against. Well, I should be grateful for that. And yes, you should. But it's not enough. And you think about where we came from, our ancestors, what they struggled against, and from the time we were, from our animal forebears all the way up to where we are now. Whatever we're made for, it's not Twinkies and TV. It's not willful blindness and the comfort that brings. It's not enough. And so we need this adventure. And that's something we're going to all have to contend with, because if we don't get the adventure right, then we'll get it wrong, and it'll lead us in terrible places. And that's already happened. Orwell, that's such a brilliant thing that you just read. I mean, especially Orwell, because he's a lefty at heart. He's got the temperament of a liberal, and he was a socialist, and he had great, what would you call, sympathy for the working class. So much that he even sacrificed his own class identity for it. Here's the real thing. And yet he could look at phenomena like Stalin or Hitler and separate, in some sense. He gives the devil his due. You have to give the devil his due. Maybe if you do that, you can see what the devil has to offer, and you can take that and harness it for good rather than for evil. Maybe, but you have to be willing to, like one of the things I've said that people have repeated many times, and that it's in memes, and you can buy it on, merchandise items and that sort of thing. A good man is a very dangerous man who has himself under control. And no one ever says that. So you say to young men, look, like, your job is to be as dangerous as you possibly can be in every possible direction, and to control that, right? Not to be harmless and slothful and contemptible, even in your own eyes. And that way you get the power of the shadow. You don't have to dispense with the anger and the aggression. You can integrate it. And that's way better. I mean, I had a remarkable conversation with Jocko Willink. I felt that it was remarkable. It was very engrossing. And Willink, he's unlike me in many ways. I mean, he's a physical specimen of sort of unparalleled proportions to begin with. He's about 2 feet thick. you know, and he's this military guy, highly disciplined and also extraordinarily morally integrated. And he's an admirable person because the danger is right there under the surface. But he has it rather than it having him. And we're uncomfortable with the idea that that's the proper route for socialization. We try to teach our children that only, cooperative games are acceptable. And they know in their hearts that that's a complete bloody lie. It's not technically sustainable. It's not even conceptually correct. I'm not saying I've solved it. I talk to Bjorn about this a lot. It's like, I love your message. Wouldn't it be wonderful to eradicate absolute poverty? And he does this great job technically of rank ordering global concerns, doing a cost benefit analysis that's methodologically rigorous and saying, look, we can devote money here. We'll get a 20-to-1 return. It's mostly in child nutrition, as it turns out. Couldn't we do an immense amount of good with targeted spending? And the answer is clearly yes. We could eradicate child poverty in the next 15 years. We probably will. We could do great things, but we don't know how to sell it. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, just saying let's invest in mosquito nets isn't very sexy. It's not very romantic. It doesn't sound like something grandiose. I wonder if that's also fueling in part the current anti-racism movement. We've made a lot of progress since the civil rights movement. Dr. King and his activists, I think they would be pretty proud of how far we've come. By most measures, race relations are the best they've ever been in this country. And yet, if you read the anti-racist books, which I have, you'd think we're living in a racist cesspool. Things have never been so bad. And those books are getting just snapped up. I mean, way more than, say, my book, The Moral Arc, or Pinker's books. Because that kind of, and it's not just the negativity of it, negativity bias is stronger than the positivity bias.
Yeah.
But also maybe, I just got to thinking about this from what you just said, maybe they're selling this kind of almost messianic message. There's one thing, this explains everything. It's racism. Well, but what about all these people that aren't racist? They're implicitly racist. They're subconsciously racist. All the structure, the banking system, the Wall Street, everything, the entire economy is racist, and on and on and on. And it's like the appeal of a conspiracy theory, like it's the complexities of poverty and war and so on. The 20 different variables and social scientists have to run these complex regression equations to tease out which variable. No, forget all that. It's this one thing. Oh. It's appealing, but also I think more than just appealing. It's that kind of messianic. It's romantic in a way.
It's romantic right to its core. It has this mythological structure. It's like it's the corrupt patriarchy, and that's a mythological trope. It's the blind king who is once great and now is archaic and willfully blind, and the goal of the hero is to overthrow him and replace him with vision. That's what you call young people to do. Well, that ideology that you're describing parasitizes that narrative. And it has immense power. And it is definitely the case that the rationalist, atheist, enlightenment types, for all their pragmatic benevolence, and I'm not saying that cynically, I'm really not. I'm thrilled that there are thousands of people who aren't starving as much every day now. I mean, who wouldn't be thrilled about that? But there's a reason it's not a headline. It's not a headline. And so the economics are pragmatic. The capitalist framework, the benevolent capitalist framework that surrounds this idea of incremental improvement appears sound. It's working, but it doesn't take genuine human psychology into account, especially with regards to the young. And it's not like I know how to solve that problem. The only thing I've seen that I can contribute in some sense is that I've never had more of a response from a crowd than when I draw a relationship between responsibility and meaning. Without fail, that brings the crowd to silence. And it's because that connection hasn't been made explicit sufficiently, I would say, is that we find meaning in responsibility. And there is a messianic call that's embedded in this. And you can translate that into Get yourself together. See what you could become. And, much of Beyond Order is exactly that. It's push your limits, move beyond yourself, discipline yourself, but move beyond that discipline. Don't let that order constrain who you could be, because it's not a high enough order yet. And I would say it looks like that is attractive to young people, and perhaps specifically to young men, but not only to young men, and not only to the young. So, well, that's a problem that we have to address. Is, we are doing a lot of things right, but it's not romantic enough.
Yeah. Yeah. What frustrates me about that is that if there are still obviously some problems of racism, but we need to just target them. It's not the police. It's that guy right there on that police force on that day. He did that one thing, and we got to get to the heart of that particular problem. It's like when Princeton University issued that statement a few months ago saying, we are implicit in the racism problem, and we've been part of the problem, and we're doing all these bad things. And then the Trump administration said, oh, yeah, well, that would be illegal. That would be a violation of Title IX and so on and so forth. So what did you do exactly? They go, oh, well, we didn't do anything exactly. We just mean kind of generally. It's like, okay.
Yeah, look, if you claim culpability long enough, people are going to believe you, and so will you. And once you're culpable, you will not defend yourself because you don't have a moral leg to stand on. You'll be justifying your own oppression. And you deserve it. You're culpable? Okay. What claim do you have to your position then? Even in your own eyes. It's appalling to see this. It's absolutely appalling. And that's not to say that discrimination doesn't exist. Of course it exists, and it's not good. It serves no one except people who have their positions because of arbitrary power. And so, but look, I've become convinced that the best story wins. And the incremental rationalists and atheists aren't telling the best story. You can tell that because they're not winning. So, and I also have faith in human beings to think that the best good story will defeat the best evil story.
There's your next book, Jordan. You got to channel your inner Pinker and write the messianic good news story. Or something like that.
It's an intractable problem,
Yes,
yes. To find out how to make this motivating. What do we do with our luxury and our wealth now that we've attained it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, and I suppose you see a lot of this in your personal practice. I like the stories in your books about your clinical practice. Obviously, you change the names and so forth. But to what extent does that experience, your lifelong experience of being a clinician, and your own personal experiences? I was reminded that this morning starting to listen to Maps of Meaning, because you have some autobiographical material at the beginning about your own religious journey, but also your personal struggles as a youngster, and then as a young man with depression and some physical ailments, and you talk about bad dreams, and I got to thinking, I wonder, between that and then the clinical practice where you're mostly seeing people that have problems, or else they wouldn't be there. To what extent does that sort of color your view of human nature or human history, or the whole big picture we've been talking about?
Well, I think it probably exaggerates it to some degree. Like, I'm intensely emotional on the positive end and the negative end, and so I think my experience perhaps it's more extreme than that of many people. And, the proclivity I have towards depression is probably bipolar to some degree. I haven't had manic episodes, but I've had lots of periods where I had tremendous amount of energy. Luckily, that's never tipped into mania, and it's been very useful to me because I've been very productive during those periods of time. But I do think it makes my experience extreme. And so the negative elements are very, very negative, and the positive elements are very positive. The clinical experience and my lecturing experience has been unbelievably positive in the main. And the clinical experience was positive because I was always on the side of the part of the person that was oriented towards their own health and improvement. That was part of our contractual pact. I'd often make that explicit. It's like, I'm not here for unconditional positive regard. I'm on the side of the part of you that wants everything to be better. And we're going to discover where that is, and we're going to work to facilitate it. And people loved that. And it was so gratifying to engage in that work. It was constantly positive. I worked with a huge variety of people, from people who had nothing, no gifts, and were just off the edges of the world, to people who were unbelievably talented and gifted, the whole gamut. And that was absolutely wonderful to see that range of people. And the lecturing has been the same way. Like the lecture tour I did was immensely positive, too much positive even. You wouldn't think that would be possible, but it is possible. And I'm very positively oriented towards human beings in the main, despite I think we're great. Flawed and terribly, but no wonder. No wonder. I mean, the burden we bear is absolutely, it's absurd. The existentialists made much of that. We have an absurd existence. We're aware of our own mortality. God, and we're animals. We're aware of our own mortality. What a burden. And yet here we are. And much of the time we're not corrupt and horrible. It's a miracle.
Yeah, you've obviously tapped into a deep need. I noticed Beyond Order is #1 in the Wall Street Journal last week, and I think #1 on New York Times this coming Sunday's paper. They always lag
they
a
put
few
me
weeks
with
behind.
miscellaneous and advice, but
Oh, they did?
So I thought that was kind of funny.
Although on Amazon,
maybe
on Amazon last week, I see you got topped by Dr. Zeus. I think Dr. Zeus had the first 24 top spots.
That was so funny. Yeah, it was like I was number 13 and Dr. Seuss occupied 1 through 12.
That's right. Yeah. See,
it's really comical.
I wish my books would get canceled and have such good sales. Yeah, that's too funny. But seriously, I mean, obviously people need to hear this. It would be interesting to have a study done on your readers and the people who attend your talks. If they all took a Big Five personality inventory, where they'd score. I don't know if you ever thought about that. I mean, who needs this? Who's getting the most out of this?
It isn't obvious. I would say the audience tilts towards younger people, and it tilts towards male. But it's hard to tell how much of that is because YouTube is a male. Most people watch YouTube are male, and the biggest chunk of my audience is really YouTube. I don't know the demographics of the readership. Women tend to buy more books than men. So I suspect the sex ratio among book buyers is closer to 50-50. It isn't obvious to me that there's been a type. I think it's people, I could say, well, it's people who are searching. But I'm not even, first of all, that's pretty cliched. And second of all, it's not even obvious to me that that's true. I think sometimes people read my books and then figure out that they're searching. I think what I'm doing effectively, and I base this on, like I read the YouTube comments and my book reviews from the public. I'm encouraging people who aren't, and that's not a typical thing for elite liberal types to do. And this is something maybe we can close with this. Look, there's something I've really noticed that's been interesting about the reaction of the educated elite to my books. I mean, I was called the stupid person, smart person in Canada by Tabitha Southey, and I thought that was a pretty good phrase, man. She really nailed that. She's quite the cat of a creature in writing, but she nailed that phrase, quite snarky and contemptuous, but can turn a phrase. And I thought about that for a long time, and I thought, well, the people who read and listen to me and so on aren't going to take kindly to that description, but they're used to it. Because one of the driving forces for populism is the unbelievable contempt that the liberal leftist elite, with all their compassion, have for the people they are hypothetically helping. Like, we're in the position to help them. Now, I'm encouraging those people, let's say, because I'm writing to a broad general audience. I'm not writing to intellectuals. I'm writing for a broad general audience. And I'm saying implicitly and explicitly, there's a lot more to you than you think, and there's certainly a lot more to you than other people think, and you have something of value to contribute to the world, and the human race isn't a catastrophic and contemptible mess, and let's get on with it and make yourself better and educate yourself and all of this. And all that's met with, I would say, among mainstream critics of my books, pretty much without exception, although there are exceptions, is contempt for the people that I'm addressing. And I think that's unbelievably illuminating. I saw this T-shirt in Florida when I was down there last year, Trump 2020, because fuck you twice. And I thought,
yes, right, exactly.
Yes.
Oh, maybe here's another factor. You had that great quote in there from, was it Orwell? That it's not that liberals love the poor, they just hate the rich.
Yes, it's even more specific than that. It's not that they love the poor, it's that they hate anyone richer than them.
I do think that you're being targeted in part just because you're so prominent, and that that just goes with the territory. I mean, Carl Sagan had experienced that. Steve Gould did as well. They wanted to be taken seriously as scientists. They were serious scientists, but because they were on TV and prominent as public intellectuals, they just got relentlessly hammered. And I think that in part goes with the territory, but also you're touching not physics and cosmology and evolutionary biology. You're touching human nature, society, the things that we care about, and so that that adds to the fuel, I think. And
yeah, well, it wasn't so much the targeting of me that I was objecting to in the criticisms. It was the implicit contempt for my audience. It's not good. It's not good, And if I am the stupid person, smart person, and if I am talking to the basket of deplorables, it's like, well, really, are those people so contemptible that? Yeah, right. That was an election losing phrase, right? Because like the election hung on a thread.
I'm a pretty self-motivated person, and I don't really feel like I ever need self-help books, but I get a lot out of reading your books. And as an athlete, I'm a lifelong athlete. I work out every day, 2 hours a day. I do 10,000 miles a year on my bike. I'm really disciplined. But when I read Jocko Willink, I get a lot out of that. It's like, yes, I need that extra little, put the clothes out ahead of time the night before, because at 5 a.m, I'm not going to want to get up, and I'm going to need every motivation. He has those little tools, and you could say, yes, those are for the little people or the weak people, but no, I'm pretty strong, and yet I still get a lot out of Jocko Willink. I love his whole video about good. I have to remind myself of that occasionally. Like when something bad happens, I have to channel my inner Jocko and think, good, that's good this happened. And then I think, no, it isn't. Yes, it is. This kind of tension in my own head. And so I think everybody needs those kinds of structure that, again, chaos reigns. The second law of thermodynamics, entropy, that I wrote about at the end of that article I wrote about you. In essence, I ended that article saying, I agree with you. I mean, life is hard. It's chaotic. There's just more ways, like a sandcastle. There's more ways for a blob of sand to be nothing than there are for the sand to be structured in the form of a castle.
Right, and that is chaos. That's exactly it. And so, so it's a word of encouragement, and that's what people are responding so positively to in a time where everyone is told this story that human activity is all a struggle for power, and that we're fundamentally a destructive force, and that we should rein ourselves in. And I'm not selling that message. It's a word of encouragement. You could be more than you are, and wouldn't that be great for everyone, including you? And so,
well, Jordan, thank you for your work. Thank you for your books, and thanks for taking 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours. We're almost going full Joe Rogan on here. And so it's good to see your energy is back up.
Just about. Yeah, I wasn't sure I could do Joe yet with that immense 3 hour demand that he places on someone. So, yeah. Well, thanks for your kind comments about my book too at the end of this, and I'm very glad to hear that that you found it useful, at least in some regards. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Great. Well,
perhaps post-COVID, we'll be able to see each other again. I think the last time I saw you in person was in Toronto, like 1.5 years ago, back in the before time.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll return to that time at some point.
I think we're getting there. All right, Jordan, you take care. And thanks again. Bye-bye.
See you, Michael. Pleasure. Bye-bye.